Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Damon Wilson. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. And I'm really delighted to welcome you all to here today for a public event and conference on Moldova, reform efforts and regional outlook. I want to welcome everyone in the room as well as everyone who's following online. I encourage all of those who want to take part in the conversation via social media to use the hashtag AC Eurasia, that is Atlantic Council Eurasia. And I want to welcome all of our distinguished speakers who are with us today, many of whom have traveled from Moldova to be with us, and some of whom we've had the opportunity to host here on the stage in the past. We're welcoming back to the stage Speaker Andrian Candu, Deputy Speaker Iurie Leanca. It's terrific to have you. I'm also pleased to have from the Atlantic Council leadership and our board, two of our board directors who have a strong, deep interest in Moldova and have supported that work at the Atlantic Council on Europe's East. Delighted to recognize Steve Nicandros, who is a member of our International Advisory Board, and to Bob Abernathy, who is a vice chair and a member of the executive committee of the board, both of whom have strong ties back to Moldova. I think as many of you in this room know, and many of you watching online understand, that the Atlantic Council and the Eurasia Center in particular, led by Ambassador John Herbst, that we have an active, strong program designed to promote security, prosperity, and democracy throughout Eurasia, including Moldova. Our community here is strongly supportive of Moldova's efforts to support a modern, open society and to maintain its sovereignty and territorial integrity in very difficult circumstances. We believe that open market democracies in Europe's East should have the right to determine their own destiny, and as they succeed at home, have a pathway to join the core of the transatlantic community and Europe itself. This meeting is taking place in Washington on the heels, I think, of some significant developments, a recognition of the European Parliament that recently passed a resolution recognizing that Moldova, as a part of the Eastern Partnership, should and could eventually be considered for membership. That there is an understanding that Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine have set themselves out on a difficult, long, but different journey with a destination at the heart of Europe. And yet, we all recognize that to achieve those strategic ends, there's a tough road ahead. There's a lot of work to be done. We're going to look at the two key issues today that are relevant to that. A very difficult and heavy reform agenda that has to move forward within the country, and to recognize that anything done inside the country is not taking place in a benign environment. It's against the backdrop of very clear Russian disinformation, interference, presence in Transnistria, and this is likely to perhaps grow. So as Moldova continues to develop economically, to enact reforms and strengthen its ties with the EU, we believe that the United States, working with Europe, must support that progress inside the country and work more intentionally to deter any threats posed by nefarious activity in the region, whether from organized crime or from Russia itself. We also have a sense here in Washington that at a time of some degree of political uncertainty about the role of the United States, about our relationship with Europe, that this is a time when there's uncertainty in the core of the transatlantic relationship, when some of our adversaries will look to exploit those opportunities. And so it's more important forever, we believe, to help formulate a community around an idea of a West that's committed to working with countries in the region to forge a path for a secure, independent, democratic Moldova and its rightful place in Europe. So today kicks off what I would say is going to be a bit of an intensified effort at the Atlantic Council as we take a look at our work in Europe's East, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova in particular. And we expect to look in the months and years ahead to continue to work closely with across all sectors in these countries, in Moldova, with all friends and partners to support this difficult path and to help advance and build U.S.-Moldova relations. At the strategic level, our team here with Ambassador Herbst and our other colleagues who will be speaking today, at a strategic level, we are trying to move our country into a way of thinking about a U.S. policy that in many respects thinks of a hardening of emerging democracies in Eastern Europe. And that hardening process means how to support a bolstering of reform, very difficult and uneven reform processes at home, while also an intentional strategy to check nefarious influence, particularly Russian influence in this region, with the overall objective of our work being to not allow fault lines to settle, firm fault lines to settle on the frontiers of freedom in Europe's East, but to erase some of those dividing lines and to underscore that there will not be a permanent gray zone in Europe's East. A permanent gray zone in Europe's East is a recipe for instability and conflict and failures in reform. And it's with that view that our work is designed to help figure out a strategy that goes forward, bolstering reforms at home, marrying them with a regional strategy. We'll develop and play out those two themes during the course of today's conference. And this isn't just a conversation for us. This is an effort to look at some very difficult issues and to try with a community of people that follow these issues to really build what the elements of that strategy should look like. I'm delighted to transition and turn over this podium to someone who's at the heart of what I believe this strategy is and should be, someone who's playing a leading role in Moldova. Mr. Andrian Candu is the Speaker of Parliament of the Republic of Moldova and the Deputy President of the Democratic Party of Moldova. He's one of those partners that I've referred to. Mr. Candu was previously a senior manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Moldova, before being elected to the Moldovan Parliament in November 2014. He is playing a lead role in his position within the Parliament on the reform agenda, but also through his visits where we've had the chance to meet Atlantic Council delegations, whether in Chisinau, in Europe, or here in Washington, playing a role in helping to advance this narrative on the international stage, particularly here in Washington. We welcome you back to Washington. We welcome you back to the Atlantic Council. Andrian, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, dear friends of Moldova, it is a great pleasure to be here today and to be able to speak in front of such an esteemed and well-informed audience about Moldova's reform efforts and about the regional outlook. I want to start by thanking Atlantic Council for hosting this talk, which I hope will provide the best and the most accurate and honest snapshot about Moldova's strong points and challenges faced. In January 2018, there will be 2 years since the Democratic Party of Moldova and the Moldovan European People's Party took over as the main parties of the government. For starters, before taking or talking about the present and the future, let us do a short reminder of the past, because this is very relevant. I invite you to compare between where Moldova was 2 years ago and where it is today. This really helps us putting things into perspective. 2 years ago, Moldova was at the brink of the collapse. Tens of thousands of people protesting on the streets denouncing the banking fraud and corruption, the economy in continuous fall, and the real possibility for the state not to be able to pay wages and pensions, international isolation, and serious doubts about the continuation of the European path. We made it out of the woods. 2015 was the year of the house, 2016 the year of the stability, and 2017 can be considered the year of growth and investments. Today the reality looks completely different than we have started. We have economic growth rate at over 4% and the second lowest inflation rate at the least, I would say, in the least 25 years. The street protests have ceased. Moldova has concluded a very successful summit of the Eastern Partnership at the end of November, which confirmed our European aspirations. Also, the agreement with IMF is on track, and the list of comprehensive reforms adopted or implemented is substantial. So Moldova is back on track. This is not to say that all our problems are over, of course. Our government and the parliament are not the perfect, and neither is the situation in the country or in the region. But we mean well, and we act as best as we can. In spite of the internal and external challenges, we continue to work to strengthen our democracy and to consolidate the rule of law, to tackle corruption, and to build strong institutions. The formal institutions we have set up have to become not only fully operational, but also very effective. What I can assure you is that the will of the government and the ruling coalition to fully embrace the Western-oriented reforms should be beyond any doubt. We are keen for political, social economic modernization, for the rule of law, and let me emphasize this, a needed change in mentalities. Moldova can be successful, is increasingly so, and must learn not to fear success. Someone said that a vision without actions is a daydream, and an action without vision is a nightmare. We have the vision, and we know how to act. The key things are on the roll in the country, reforming and transforming the country every day, restoring the banking and financial industry, especially after the crisis in 2014, reforms in judiciary and fighting against corruption, energy security in terms of legislation and infrastructure projects, modern mass media legislation and development of the civil society, improving the business environment. These are the key areas of our day-by-day activity. Next year, 2018, will not be an easy year for a young democracy like in Moldova. A real danger exists that the pro-Russian Socialist Party will win the majority of the seats following the parliamentary elections. With President Dodon controlling the parliament, there would not be many reasons for optimism. To the contrary, the socialists have already announced that they want to denounce the association agreement with the European Union and put the end of our European dream. That would be a dramatic wake-up call. Given the majoritarian backing of the European path, this could lead months, if not years, into a Maidan-like scenario, as the population will not accept such an outcome. Moldovans deserve better. We believe it is the duty of the pro-European forces to prevent the backsliding. Despite all the things that divide us from other political parties, we are ready to work with all those who share our broader vision for the future of Moldova. Unfortunately, we live in a region where the respect of other countries' options is very short supply. It's really a rough neighborhood for an aspiring kid. This kid is keen to succeed. Help kid to develop his own dream in the American way. Unfortunately, we have become a battleground for Russian interests in the region. Our banks have been used to money launder 20 billion by Russian-backed companies. The media and online propaganda are used to undermine the democratic foundations of our state. The economic sanctions are designed to cripple our economy. Moreover, the Russian army is still stationed on our territory and refuses to leave despite our official requests. The times are not good for small countries in our part of the world, and Moldova is in high need of strong and committed friends. And United States is one of these partners and is one of these countries. Strong, and it is a role model in terms of development and values institutions. Some could argue that the West has already too many problems to deal with the ones Moldova has. Our plea is that the aspirations for freedom, independence, and dignity should never be treated with cynicism. Moldova has a pro-Western majority and determination to close the development and democratic gap. It's my strong belief that Moldova could be the next success of Eastern Europe, provided that its aspirations will be welcomed and encouraged by its partners. We come in dignity and hope to the Washington, D.C., while in a mirror, President Dodon has a monthly Hug the Lord of the Rings meetings in Moscow. The contrast is obvious, while the solutions is also more Western political support and visits to Moldova. It's a key battleground, and do not underestimate the potential for the regional disruption, including Ukraine and Romania, in case Moldova becomes a base for Russian state propaganda and active measures. But bad things can be prevented, and we should focus on the positive. We know reforms are important. We will deliver, and not just for the West, but because it's key for our citizens, because we care. I end with this message that dare to believe in Moldova's Western dream, our only hope for prosperity and dignity. Thank you very much. Good luck for the conference, for the panelists, and hopefully we can find today not only to debate the challenges that we face, but eventually the solutions that we can have. Thank you very much.
Well, even though the speaker has asked us to discuss not only the challenges, in fact, the subject of our first panel is Moldova's domestic challenges. So I hope we will also get, during our discussion, not only to some of these problems, but also some of potential solutions and suggestions and reforms, and as well as some of the optimism right now that's coming out of Moldova. And certainly also, as Damon Wilson said, what is happening today in Moldova is also not occurring in a benign context. That's another element we'll keep in mind as we're discussing on this panel. So first I wanted to, introduce myself. I'm Agnia Grigas. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, and introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Andrian Åslund. He is a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council and one of our top economists, really, I have to say, at our organization. He's an expert on post-Soviet economies. We also have Roman Chirca. He is visiting us from Moldova. He's the general director of the Institute for Market Economy since 2012, and he spent many years working with the U.S. Department of Commerce. Then we have Timothy Fairbank, also from the Atlantic Council, a senior fellow here, and also an adjunct at RAND. He just returned from Moldova yesterday, and he was there just 6 weeks ago, so it will be interesting for us to hear some of his impressions. And finally, Mr. Serghei Ostaf, the executive director for the Resource Center for Human Rights, and also someone who spends time in the United States. He did his MBA here at Newport University. So we'll start off with brief comments, from our panelists, from their area of expertise, and then we'll go into some Q&A and hopefully have some time. Well, we will make some time for the questions from the audience. So Dr. Åslund, if you could kick us off, please, with an overview in your perspective of the Moldovan economy and current state of affairs from that economic perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much, Agnia. I would like to say that I very much agree with what Speaker Candu said here. And if I summarize it in 2 words, Moldova has proven that it's on the right track now in terms of macroeconomic stability and so forth for the last 2 years. The question today is, can Moldova really rise to a substantial growth rate as it should? So if we take the macroeconomic situation, it has greatly improved in the last 2 years, and Moldova now looks is in the good books of the International Monetary Fund. What happened in the summer of 2015 was a massive shock. 3 banks collapsed, $1 billion disappeared, and this was the real big bank robbery. You know, the best way of robbing a bank is to own a bank, because then you rob the money from the deposit holders and from the central bank, and not from yourself, because you only own about 8% of the capital in a normal of assets in a normal case. But that has been cleaned out, and Moldova is now on a steady growth path of about 4% a year. The budget is under control. Inflation is in the single digits. The exchange rate is floating, and the currency value is rising. It looks just as it should be. International reserves are sufficient. No worries at all. And I think that this is quite a considerable achievement. So then we come to the next question. Economic growth. 4% is decent. For a poor country like Moldova, it should be 7%. That's where one would like to see Moldova. What is missing? I would essentially say one thing: real property rights. And this is the same problem as in virtually all post-Soviet countries, with a single exception of Georgia, where the reforms under Mikhail Saakashvili managed to establish property rights. And I would argue that Moldova needs to follow what was done in Georgia and what is being maintained in Georgia by the current government. Clean up the judicial system, get the prosecutors right. If you get those 2 institutions right, then you get real property rights. Then Moldova can start growing by 7% a year. I should also add, what is vital and what Moldova has got right is the European Union. There are 2 things that are important there. One is trade access. Moldova has done that quite well, and you have now half of the exports going to the European Union, although Moldova produces primarily agricultural goods. I think this is a great achievement, and I think that you will go much further in that regard. And you have got the visa freedom, which is a double-edged sword, because it also means emigration. But Moldova has accomplished a lot. So now the issue is judicial reform. Do it and get it right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Åslund. Now, Roman Chirca, if, you know, Dr. Åslund painted a very positive picture, and can you discuss more about the reforms that are ongoing? And particularly, you know, maybe even some of the reforms in the banking sector. As we heard, I mean, $20 billion have essentially disappeared from the banking system, or have been laundered through the Moldovan banking system. So we look forward to your thoughts.
Thank you, Agnia. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Indeed, actually, the 1 billion fraud, it's a brand. In fact, it was a little bit less, but that doesn't change the fact that we had serious issues in the banking system. Indeed, we have stabilization. I wouldn't call it a positive picture. It's a normality to recover, and I think we returned to 2013, where we had huge national bank reserves, where we had kind of stability within a latent political crisis. So actually we have the national bank's reserves are $2.6 billion. And that make us that leads to a conclusion that we spent so many times, and we returned to a situation in 2013. Indeed, 2016 was a year of stabilization. Our economic model is based on, and the primary source of our growth is the transfer from our migrants, and the normal growth rate would be 3.5. Everything which is higher mean there are other positive symptoms, and this year we have an estimate of 4.6% growth, which put us on a positive scenario, and that's also influenced highly by agriculture. At the same time, as with the reforms, there are some particularities. A lot of things have been initiated. I wouldn't call this proper reform because there was a short time, and at the core of our so-called stabilization and positive success is the reestablishing the relations with the IMF. Mm-hmm. IMF is the core and the intermediary with other developing partners, because IMF, with its conditionality, and primarily its focus was on bank sector regulation, the European directive on bank regulation was approved, along with other initiatives. What is surprisingly in all this reform implementation is the speed, how quick they are implemented. Which means that the government takes the initiative in implementing them, but it's not an inclusive reform. It doesn't include all the actors of the economy, of the society. In other ways, the government says we know better what we have to do, which is in the long term cannot be right. We need to have this inclusivity in the process. We have a lot of stuff to do. Well, government is successful where he has to do something with logistics, like for example the assignment of a credit line with European Investment Bank and EBRD for the gas pipeline from Romania to Chisinau, capital of Moldova. That was quick. Other stuff like to have an impression how government reacts to the need to do reform. That doesn't mean necessarily quality of the reform. In June 2016, everybody was very skeptical about potential IMF agreement, and there were some rumors that some preconditions were imposed by IMF, but the skepticism was very high. In August, September, we had an announcement by IMF that most likely the agreement will be signed. And there was a list of commitments, and Moldova reacted very quickly. So that's surprisingly, even for a small country like Moldova. But at the same time, I fully agree with Mr. Åslund. The property is an issue which brings the way the property is acquired in our society. It was acquired for a long time. Is using governmental tools, using government as an instrument to acquire and to maintain a property. That brings and gives a lot of useless energy to the political fight. The political parties are fighting less for their ideology, but most for taking part in these properties and maintaining the property. We have a huge anonymous so-called property. And you have the only document that legitimates your property is being a party, having being in a government, being in parliament, which is absolutely wrong and has to be changed. And for that purpose, the government even has initiated a so-called an amnesty, and a set of measures are needed in order to have this problem solved. And that was so crude, so unprepared initiative that failed, which means much more complex things, like involving the entire society, like legalizing the property. These things are much more difficult, a task that difficult to perform by the government. At the same time, something sectorial, something logistical, that's easy, and it looks like the government likes to do that. So that would be a brief introduction. And
Thank
overview.
you. Well, we'll
Thank
follow
you.
up with more questions on that. So Timothy, if you could share with us some of your impressions from your recent trip, and also particularly, let's not forget that Russia factor that we've alluded to in Moldova's environment, and as well as maybe on the state of reforms a bit.
Sure. I think throughout this panel there was 4 things I wanted to touch on. One was the increase in Russian pressure in Moldova. 2 was the state of reforms. 3, progress in Transnistria recently, especially the talks in Vienna in late November. And 4th, sort of the issue of the need for maybe political compromise on the pro-European parties. For now, I'll kind of stick with Russian pressure, Russian aggression in Moldova. And I view it as on a timeline. Obviously, with the issue in Transnistria, there have been Russian troops on Moldovan territory since the very beginning, since 1992. But I think we saw really an increase in Russian pressure 2002, 2003, when President Voronin was in power, when they vetoed the Kozak plan for resolving the Transnistria issue. That's when we saw a little bit of a shift, an increase in Russian involvement, Russian interference in Moldova. I think the next step would be 2009. 2009 is when we saw a coalition of pro-European parties enter parliament and win parliament, defeating the communists for the first time. And I think this last stage would be 2014 issue, 2015, and then increasingly over the last couple of years. I think the tactics that we're seeing happening are pretty much the same. It's just the increase, the methods are the same, the level of interference has grown. So I look at it as kind of 4 different areas. One is increased intelligence agents in Moldova. We have an increase in FSB, increase in GRU. You find a lot of FSB officers that were in London, that were in the US, including San Francisco and other places, have entered Moldova. These are people with technical skills that pose sort of a more advanced and a more nuanced and elaborate schemes. Sort of 2, I think the amount of media and propaganda that is going on in Moldova has increased. Also on Russian channels, where you used to see, say, negative stories on Moldova occur once every couple of weeks, once a month. Now you're seeing it almost on a daily basis. The 3rd issue is financing. I think the financing from Russia's side of socialists, communists, other politicians interfering in voting there, using funds to pay for civil society groups, that's increased a lot as well. And 4th, I think Russia's ability to influence the business and the economy in Moldova. You do have, I think one of the positive things we've talked about, or that I think Speaker Candu and others alluded to, right now we're seeing probably 2/3 of Moldova's exports go to the European Union, which is a positive thing. But the Russian market is still an important market for Moldova. Currently, the only companies that are able to export to Russia are those that are on an exempt list, those businesses that are in generally Transnistria, Gagauzia, and Moldova proper that are approved by President Dodon. So that's something that worries me as well. We could talk about Transnistria later.
Later, because
and maybe we'll get to that later.
Yes.
So I'll stop now.
Thank you. So Sergio, if you could give us a little bit the lay of the land in terms of democratic institutions and their resilience, their strengths and weaknesses in the face of some of these external threats as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the logic, of course, of assessment of the degree of resilience and strength of democratic institutions now in 2017 depends very much of what has happened in 2015 and 16, given the financial banking crisis and later on political crisis, and a huge substantial confrontation that has happened within the, let's say, pro-European political parties that has also been used substantially by the opposition, which is a pro-Russian one. So this is kind of the dynamics shaped the way how democratic institutions functioned, and the basis of let's say at the We can also look at to what degree the justice reforms, anti-corruption efforts have been successful. There have been a lot of challenges over this period of time. If we look at the anti-corruption efforts, this is, I think, one of the aspects that should be reflected mostly. We can say that, I mean, the three aspects of a corruption phenomenon in Moldova has been like petty corruption, which is very much at the lower level, but people put it at the top 5 problems that in Moldova. It has been number 2 and 3, now it goes a bit down. And still health sector, the customs and the like is being profiled very much by the people and small businesses as the area of the concentration of corruption. But there is also grand type of corruption related to the weaknesses of the institutions in Moldova, but also some political influences that exist. And of course, unreformed, and here the reforms come as important. First, of course, the energy and banking sector, which is not only the issue of the property, but I think it's also about the issue of the monopolization. And I mean, the energy sector is still 100% dependent on Russia. So Russia can use a lot of the leverage to influence what is going on there. And it's unfortunately, it's also a source of income for some politicians who could also serve the interests. This is the real capture of the energy sector that has happened back in 1996, 1997, and it still prevails over a certain important area of activity. I mean, the issue of the weak institutions that fight corruption, it's first is related to the public tenders system has just recently been put in order in terms of creating the appeal agency that looks into the appeals from different agencies. But we also can understand that the public tenders is more than, I think, a third of the Moldovan budget, and it has to be definitely transparency brought in place and the like. If we look at the justice sector, it's you know, it's an interesting observation. Actually, on the corruption, we have also still since 2013 Moldova implemented the asset and income declaration system, which opens up a lot of the information about the public sector. There are of course difficulties in implementation, and there was a recent reform of this agency, and of course there are attempts to influence the way how it functions, and not free from the influences from within the bureaucracy that doesn't want actually to open up more information about what they have, but also politicians are trying to meddle with it. And so strong anti-corruption institutions, I think, is one of the major challenges that are still there. So on the justice, in few words, what I can say in my understanding is that there was a lot of transformation, institutional transformations, and fewer focus on the direct impact and benefits of the people. And therefore you have a discrepancy between not enough recognition. I mean, people don't put a big value of the creation of the self-governing judiciary institution in Moldova, or the fact that the appointment procedure of the heads of the courts, of the judges themselves and the like, are done in a much less politicized manner. They want actually the quality of the justice, accessibility of the justice, and the trust in the justice system. And here, the last 5-6 years transformation, institutional transformations, have shadowed actually the direct benefits to the people. Therefore, people still look very much with distrust the way how the system functions. So transparency of the decisions, then also the predictability in terms of the quality of the justice system. So these are still the issues which are pending, and they're actually eroding on the quality of the justice and also functioning of the state. I think so. There is the right track, the right direction there, but not enough. Anchoring the results on the benefits of the people. Therefore, people don't see immediately and recognize the efforts.
Absolutely, and actually this brings us to a question I wanted to circle back to with Anders. I mean, really this, lack of predictability, corruption, lack of transparency, as you say, and the benefits not trickling down to the people is resulting, as you alluded to, a major problem and a major future potential problem for Moldova and its emigration. I mean, Moldova today is one of, if not the poorest countries in Europe. I mean, that's another element. So, Anders, if you could maybe what are your thoughts on emigration in Moldova, and do you think this is a critical problem today, or is this something that's going to emerge as one of the critical problems?
I think it has been the critical problem. It will remain the critical problem for a long time. If we look upon the region as a whole, Moldova, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Armenia, the three Baltic states, they have very different economic policies, but they have all one enormous problem. They have lost about a quarter of the population since 1989, and they are continuing to lose population. Birth rates are low everywhere, and immigration is large. It's not something extraordinary in history. If you take, for example, Sweden lost one quarter of its population in the 1880s during one decade. So these have happened in most European countries at some stage. But if you look up on the average wage now, it's a bit over $200 per month. And then why not move to a country where you have $2,000 per month? And the borders are now open, so you can easily move to an EU country. This is in many ways good. Moldova has benefited enormously from remittances. I think that it's about 1/3 of GDP now. That is, or perhaps a quarter of GDP. Moldovans are going in the thousands and getting better higher education in Romania without having to pay for it, without any particular permissions. So there are good and bad sides. But if you look upon a country that had big problems with immigration, Ireland, it lasted from 1847, the big potato famine, until 1990. So these are not easily overcome problems. How can you overcome it? By getting up the salary to an ordinary European level. So this is a long problem, and at the same time you are bound to get immigration from other countries, which is not necessarily what people desire, in particular when you have ethnic divisions in a society. So to me, first we have a judicial problem, and then we have the demographic problems. These are the two big concerns I have.
Okay. And Roman, what would you highlight as one of the major issues for Romania and
Romania?
Oops, Moldova. We're discussing right now. And what about the issue of the oligarchical system and as well tied to Russian money in the country? Is that a problem that you would highlight?
Yes, and that's not a problem of today or yesterday. That's the problem. And just to continue what Mr. Åslund said, the problem of Moldova is it's not that competitive that the Europeans are. Our GDP per capita is 3,000 euros. You can say that 4.6 annual economic growth is a good figure for United States, for Germany, and for maybe for other developed country. What Moldova needs actually, in order to stop the immigration and to have their citizens coming back, it needs at least to quadruple the GDP. And Moldova currently faces investment starvation. We have underinvestment, the lowest in the region. That's because of the investment climate that has to be significantly improved. It's not just cosmetical adjustments or what government, for example, is trying to do. They're trying to negotiate directly with potential investors, and sometimes they are successful. Like they brought a Japanese company, Fujikura, other companies from the automotive sectors, and we suddenly have a new branch in our economy, automotive industry. But that's a manual way of bringing investments. What government has to do is to create this climate and investment climate. Sorry. As for the Russian money, there is huge demand for Russian money to be taken out of Russia. Maybe some of the special forces, they are just trying to hiding money, and there are also regular Russian businessmen that want to escape from Russian Putin authoritarian regime,
Yes.
and they trying a way to escape in doing that, and they probably using one of the channel, they using Moldova in that way. But now with the imposed regulations and bank supervision, I think these operations, this kind of operations are less likely to happen. At least the good news what we have now for the last
good news. We would like to hear some.
and 1.5 years that we don't hear any bad news from the banking sector, because we had a time like 2012, 13, 14. Every week we had a new breaking news announcement, a new raider attack on a bank, using even the judicial institutions in order to complete that. So I think the things are changing. We are further will go. The time will pass from the bank fraud. Better will be the investment climate in general and the perception of Moldova in general.
I guess that we should add here that this money laundering has been stopped, and I think that the IMF has pretty much verified that this has been sorted out, which is a great achievement.
Yes.
And Sergio, maybe you have some good news for us on the media sector.
Yes.
I mean, the media sector traditionally in Moldova has been very influenced, by Russian media, a lot of just simple retranslations of Russian media. Also, the media in Transnistria has been, quite, set up there and quite active in the Moldovan space as well. So maybe some good news there. Some things have changed.
Well, definitely, media is also part of democratic institutions. One of the important feature that actually defines the way how the society moves forward in understanding the changes, and also media is an important role in holding accountable the government, but also providing the freedom of speech, which is at the core of the democratic institutions. So what, I got a piece of paper that I was researching last year, and I was struck to find out that actually, like, 65-70% of Moldovan media, audiovisual media, because obviously it's not only audiovisual media, it's also internet and social media, but also underground attempts to influence the public perception. And I think in terms of the Russian influence in Moldova, it uses successfully and effectively these three ways. So audiovisual media, which is basically about 50 to 60% trusted by people or being used by people, is substantially dominated. And Moldova in these terms also is a very open economy. It allows retransmission and of the Russian content, and given that in the last 25 years it's been exposed so much to the Russian content, so about 60 to 70% of the content is being Russian produced, and you can see that it's a substantial and a leverage that they can use in terms of to achievement, and it has been proven that they have used this leverage in 2014-15, immediately after the regional crisis and annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern part of Ukraine. That has been also substantially used to destabilize situation in Moldova. So the recent initiative, long-awaited initiative to pass the law that will control actually specifically the news, but also the content of the talk shows, which are basically propaganda and attempting to undermine the democratic way of dealing with the pluralism and the like, is an important initiative that I've seen it's been passed in the first reading in the parliament. So it's an important way of controlling, not suspending actually, but I think it was yesterday, right, in the parliament, in the first reading. The another issue is that the media is not only, it's also linked to the media market, because it's also a business, we understand, and given the fact that the local content is basically, according to my figures, is between 20-25%. So that means that actually the content that we consume from audiovisual networks produced internally is only 20-25%. And of course, these are the problems related to how the audiovisual market is constructed, and whether it's free enough to actually to support the development of internal content. And given the fact that actually the Russian media is dominating the audiovisual content, of course, a substantial part of the advertisements goes specifically to support this kind of activity. So there was another draft law being discussed in these terms in Moldovan government. But not to speak about the social networks. I mean, it's a separate story where I've seen in 2014 and 15 so-called virtual armies targeting and polarizing and the like.
Not just from Moldova, certainly this is...
You saw it later on in the United States, but we saw it in 2014 and 15.
Well, I think this goes back to almost, the last 5 years, certainly. I noticed, Speaker Candu, maybe you wanted to make a comment a little bit on this point, or...
Final reading.
Final reading.
Final
okay,
reading.
Good.
Final. I see that we're a little bit tight for time, and if someone, I don't know, is keeping track of it, I will let Tim have his final comment, and I think we'll wrap it up and go for break. And maybe we can ask during breaks, engage the speakers as well.
No. We have until 10:50.
Oh, okay. Okay. And actually, we do have some time. Okay, we have plenty. So we'll have time for discussion here. Okay. So Tim, then if you could, not the final comment, then there'll be more questions coming. If you could then give us a little bit, you wanted to discuss Transnistria, and there's been some positive developments, or at least the potential for positive developments there. Maybe you can give us a little bit more insight. And then as well, I don't know if either you or someone else on the panel can also, kind of in connection with that, a little bit discuss Gagauzia as well. So please.
Sure. Before touching on Transnistria, I did want to add on to what Anders was saying about the problem with immigration. I mean, look, Moldova right now, it's been having problems over the years. Obviously, it's in a very difficult state. It needs stability. It's had government after government. It's had acting prime ministers, acting presidents, acting mayors of Chisinau. The economy is growing now, but over the last decade, 2 decades, it's a problem. It hasn't been the most stable country. So it's easy to be pessimistic. And those that are pessimistic and have complaints should be listened to. But at the same time, I think if Moldova is to succeed, you have to be supportive, and we have to be optimistic and hope that things change. I mean, if you look at new birth statistics now and think about a new child being born now and 6-7 years later, is Moldova a place where the family or the parents are going to want to raise them, or is that child, and for education, for medical issues, are they going to want to go somewhere else? So we touched on the double-edged swords of the ability
Yes. And I also on immigration, I wanted to interject a bit. I think it's also an issue not just in terms of GDP per capita and in terms of salaries. And if we can, compare, for the Baltic states, for instance, and I come from Lithuania, and again, it's a major immigration issue there. Again, GDP per capita is 10 times higher than Moldova. Salaries are significantly higher, but still there's the issue of immigration, because if people then compare still what they're getting to their salaries to those of Western Europe, people are well educated, and they feel they're competitive in the European market. And then secondary issues start coming into play, less economic, but to what extent they actually do feel, and these are some of Sergio, the issues you brought up, the issues of transparency, accountability, belief and faith in the government, and so on. And these are other elements that can spur or contain immigration.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think that what government should be looking more and more specifically and becoming more effective in delivering for the interests of the people, for the people. That means that a good understanding of the needs at the community level. Because I mean, Moldova is a rural country. It's like 65% of people live in the rural areas, so they have to be more of the increased quality of life on the community level. That means from water, sanitation to education and the like. So there should be, in these terms, I would sometimes look critically at the purely liberal democracy approach in understanding how to make the life better on the community level. On the national level, of course, there should be competition. I mean, demonopolization of the energy sector and the like. But at the community level, I think it should be more of the improvement of the quality and welfare of the citizens. And then here, actually, you derive a lot of the legitimacy in terms of how you act. And therefore, I mean, we've been doing some activities there, and understanding that actually the Western support at the community level from US, from EU was substantial, but it was not recognized enough, given the fact there was some manipulation about that. I mean, there were some examples like people starting to smile in the communities because the quality of water improved, and it doesn't damage the teeth. And the people started to smile on their pictures. You have already started to observe people started to smile. So this kind of direct benefits delivered to the people should be definitely the core priority, top priority of the government. And there you get a lot of the recognition of the Western and European process of integration and the reforms. And that should be balanced. People judge in terms of the specific deliveries to them. And then, of course, as a package, you say that how important is that to put in place the asset declaration, conflict prevention instruments, and market economy and the like. Otherwise, the Russian propaganda is actually speculating, saying that actually the government doesn't take into consideration your particular needs. What they do is they push the Western type of liberal democracy reforms. That's all that they care. And they do it for the interest of some international organizations. So this kind of propaganda and speculation could be only tackled once you have a comprehensive and intelligent way of doing and delivering to the people on the community level. Then you have the support of the people for the reform, substantial reform in the country.
Yes. Well, certainly this Russian propaganda narrative is not exclusive to Moldova. It's actually quite a broad narrative that they pursue towards Central and Eastern Europe. But Tim, coming back to Transnistria,
Sure.
and I'm hoping to hear your thoughts, and actually everyone on the panel, if subsequently.
Yeah, and I think what the developments in Transnistria, the discussions have been over the last few months, and culminated in, I think, November 27, 28 in Vienna. Probably the most progress we've seen in Transnistria in over 10 years. I think it was about a year ago in Berlin, first set out 8 kind of key areas that the two sides, Transnistria and Moldova, wanted to agree on. And I believe 5 of the 8 have been reached. Those include opening up a bridge that has been inactive since '92, so that you can, both for commercial and civilian transport. There's been an agreement on accrediting Tiraspol University so that the students there can actually apply and be accepted to schools internationally. There's some land issues, agreement on the telecommunications area, and some other parts that I'm probably not an expert on that others can speak on Transnistria. But there is, I think, some optimism there, speaking both to the OSCE ambassador on the US side, the Moldovan side, and we've seen progress with increased Ukrainian cooperation on this issue. So I think there's a lot to be optimistic about there.
If you had to make a call, and I'll actually ask my panel to make a call on this, do you think Transnistria can become reintegrated into Moldova, and what time frame would you give for that? If I can
I'm
ask.
going to punt on that question. I think the one issue of these 8, there's still not an agreement on what status Transnistria would have within Moldova, and that's going to be the sticking point.
Well,
So
I would say at the level of people perception, once you create the attractive conditions for the people to live in a reunited Moldova, I think that's something which could be a subject of between 5 to 7 years of the process. If we speak about the
to improving the conditions.
And then extending the benefits that the rest of the citizens of Moldova benefit to the Transnistrian region. I think it's a mid-term perspective. If we look at the reintegration in terms of the interest of the elites, and the region is being heavily influenced by the external factor, and let's idealistically remove the external factor, then the elites in the region, economic elites, political elites, if the external factor, the Russia factor, would be removed, I think it's also an issue of the midterm perspective, perhaps even short-term perspective, because the elites, as they are, dominating the economic life, and they could be gaining a lot.
But the Russia factor won't be removed. I'll make that call as a Russian foreign policy person.
If I may add something here.
Yes, Roman. do share your...
I think now, after 2014, after Ukraine, that is our ally in this region, we have an additional factor because no more Russian troops are coming to Transnistria through Ukraine, which is a huge achievement.
Huge victory, yes.
At the same time, I wouldn't call this conflict resolution process. Now we are talking about integration process, integration into Moldova. The one thing that remains is the Russian military presence, what we do in the end with the Russian army. But there has always been a certain point of integration, free circulation of people. Nowadays, Transnistrian economic agents, companies, they are registered as a Moldovan companies in order to do export. They are benefiting from Moldovan free trade agreement with the European Union. Most of them, they have Moldovan citizenship. Even their football team plays in a national championship in Moldova. So there is a process. I think we should go more to a certain point to perceive some to impose some taxes on companies, on Transnistrian companies on Moldovan side, to pay maybe some salaries, wages to Transnistrian citizens, pensions. And that should look more like an integration process, and now the conditions are positive for that process.
Andrews, what are your thoughts?
I very much share your view, Agnia. I don't think that we should expect anything major, but the issue is rather to manage the relationship with Transnistria. When can anything change? First, I think that if anything changes in Russia's policy towards these conflicts or disputed territories that it likes to establish, it would be in Donbass. Transnistria had 500,000 people. My guess would be that half have left. Generally, in these Russian conflict areas, half the population leaves, apart from Crimea, because of its nice climate. And in Donbass, there were 5 million people, half have left. Abkhazia was 500,000 people, as in Transnistria, half have left. So if anything is too costly for Russia, it's Donbass, not Transnistria. And we see that Putin, at least, is perfectly happy to have a few nice conflicts around that can make sure that these governments have unpleasant problems for them, pleasant for Putin, and that it means that they have big problems integrated into the Western alliances, the European Union and NATO. So if anything is really to happen, that's if Putin disappears from the Kremlin and that his regime goes. Until then, I'm afraid that the best we can hope for is the management, which is essentially what Tim talked about here.
Well,
and one important thing, I think Moldova is also being to some external factor, the whole region. Formally, the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, but still now we are in the process of the Soviet Union collapsing. The main question was, that's why we had this nostalgia for the Soviet time, is how new countries, how well are they integrated in the world economy. And many of them were successful, but not at the point sufficient. Even the Baltic states, which I think is a success story, still has a lot of potential to grow. So the question, how the new Soviet people will live in a new democratic world, that was the question that for which we don't have the answer until now. We're facing all this process because of that collapse. And something has to happen at a larger scale at this region, maybe what Mr. Åslund mentioned, but many other processes were part of huge process and phenomena than just things that are happening inside our countries.
Let me just add, a few years ago I visited Benderi, the enormous Ottoman fortress where there are 2,000 Russian soldiers. For some strange reason, they allowed us to come in and visit the fortress. And there they had built monuments trying to create Transnistrian national heroes. And who were these heroes? 3 of them. First, Marshal Suvorov, which of course makes sense since he was the one who took it to the Russian Empire. Second, Count Potemkin, who built his wonderful villages in Moldova. And third, which was the really funny one, Baron von Münchhausen. I mean, when you make Baron von Münchhausen a national hero, then you're really in dire straits.
No, so certainly, and seconding that, I mean, again, creating frozen conflict zones is part of Russia's foreign policy strategy, and it's particularly a strategy to try to prevent countries like Moldova, like Ukraine, from integrating closer to the European Union and certainly NATO. And actually, we have a report outside on frozen conflicts that we issued earlier last year. I was actually author of that report. So if interested, you can compare a little bit the different scenarios in Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and Azerbaijan. Can we touch also on Gagauzia in terms of the developments there? Because this process is a never-ending process, right? There's always an effort to try to create, from the Russian side, ethnic tensions, not just in the Transnistria, to create new sources of ethnic tensions, and Gagauzia has been one of these targets over the years.
Yeah, I think it's the challenge of the effective government to remove the leverages that Russia could have in the region, and of course the solutions are on the devolving those competitions which competencies, let's say, or attributions which would help the region to develop. It's also, in other aspects, is to become a model and to become also accountable to their own citizens, and basically projecting the way how you act towards the citizens in Gagauzia. It's also supporting the Gagauzia cultural development so that they see the world not only through the eyes of the Russian television, but through the eyes of their own interests. Because it's very much the source of the export of the labor to Russia. It's also export to Russia. They export a lot through some of the preferential treatments, and the value added of the economic activities is much lower, as if they benefit from the transfer of the modern technology. So all of these leverages, they are much softer rather than the Russian way of influencing there. And the Russia is using, of course, the operatives. They use preferential access to the market. So these are the hard ways of doing that. And of course, having their own manipulating with the political life there, and also exposing negatively the process of European integration by speculating on some prejudices and the like. So in here there is let's say that it's an interesting in terms of the battle that's going on. The West, the Moldovan government is trying to use the soft means in order to attract and lure and explain, and at the same time Russia is using these hard instruments to influence. This is not an equal battle in some terms, but I think for Moldovan government this is the only way how we can proceed to help more self-education. Of course, some regional partners can also play a role, like Turkey and Romania, increasingly delivering more of the aid to the community level, recognizing that.
Are there strong links between Turkey and the region?
There's been traditionally a lot of the influence. Turkey has also played a role in building the pipelines, water pipelines, and the like. But I think they should be playing more of the soft instruments in order to. I think at the core, the people of Gagauzia and within this region understand the benefits of the process, but somehow their links to the past and the fact that they have been educated only in the Russian language, and also the patterns of behavior and heavy exposure of the Russian media makes their choice kind of bivalent. So this is a bivalency that exists in the region.
Tim, you wanted to...
Back on Transnistria for a second, I think it would be, at least personally, this might be unpopular to say, but dishonest if we didn't at least address that there needs to be political will there. And I think there are political elites in Moldova, Ukraine, elsewhere that do benefit from the status quo. So I thought that needed to be addressed. And there are those that, through Transnistria, that benefit economically.
Particularly because it has become essentially a gray zone in international law. You're referring to that, and the crime and financial, crime and the money laundering that goes through Transnistria. That is, I assume, what you're referring to.
Yes.
Do you want to touch on that?
And there have been a few incidents in Gagauzia with some people trained in Russia.
Yes.
And ready for some destabilization, but they were minor, like
2015, yes.
less than 10. But a lot of people were recruited and fight Moldovan citizens. They fight in Donbass on the separatist side.
Moldovan citizens.
Yes, Moldovan citizens, and a lot of them are from the Gagauz region. And of course, the Transnistria. This is known facts. There is a list of with pictures. I think there are tens, maybe hundreds of people that at least 20 cases are known to be prosecuted, and many of them were they just picked up at the airport. And,
are they mercenaries or are they ideological or both?
Both. I think a combination of mercenaries and ideological influence.
Yeah, and then there are also some cells, specifically in 2014 and 15, there were set up cells of the with limited capacity to act as military within the region, and there was a response from security intelligence, but it has been, it's been on a limited scale. The number of the people who have been brought, taken out of Moldovan citizens from different regions and brought and trained in Rostov-on-Don, and then later on used in Russia, on the separatist side and the like. It's, the estimation, as Roman was saying, hundreds of the people, and some of them came back, and they form up the core of the potential cells in acting in Moldova. And it's been actually one of the plans actually to use and destabilize Moldova in 2014 and 15. So that's something that, and this is a hard instrument. It's not a soft convincing an explanation. It's about acting and producing realities on the ground using multiple diverse instruments.
I wanted to circle back to the energy issue. Particularly natural gas, and both the gas debt, Transnistria's gas debt, and then again diversification issues. So I don't know who wants to start us off.
So a good project, surprisingly good project, was the continuation of the gas pipeline from Romania to Moldova. That will bring Moldova access to the European market and Romanian market. Moldova consumes almost around 1 billion cubic meters per year, depending on 1 year. And there is a Russian announcement that in 2019 they will stop any transit of gas through Ukraine. We don't know if that's a threat or that's a realistic scenario. At least by that time, Moldova will have this pipeline alternative, which is expected.
When is it expected?
In August 2018.
Are you optimistic that it will be implemented in August 2018?
As far as we observe, and the thing that I've mentioned, there is a discipline in implementing governmental reforms, and the government is not that good at the fundamental things in the creating an investment climate or judicial reform, but they seems to be good in implementing such things. So most likely, with some delays, maybe, but in 2018, most likely we'll have this pipeline. At the same time, we have this permanent scheme of delivering gas and maintaining Transnistria, or financing Transnistria through these supplies. Russia estimates that we have a debt around $6 billion US dollars, which comes from the fact that Transnistria uses this gas without paying.
For free. Essentially, it's free gas for Transnistria, but a bill for Moldova, right?
At the same time, they're using this gas to produce electricity, and at the same time, they sell this electricity to Moldova because Moldova doesn't have any other feasible alternative. It tried to purchase it from Ukraine, but Ukraine itself is in an energy crisis and even prohibits in some period of times in the year to export electricity. So that's an issue Moldova will have to face. The gas pipeline is just one element of the puzzle, of the energetical puzzle. Other have to be solved in the future. But still, this debt, they try to convert it in a state debt. At the same time, this Moldova gas company, it's a daughter company of Gazprom, and they knew that Transnistria is not paying for the gas for so many years, and they're trying to, through an arbitrage, to create a decision, the precedent, in some way to put it on Moldovan state should. I think that's less likely, less probable to happen.
Andrews, you're shaking your head, or no? You want to?
I want to say that there is actually a link to the development of democratic institutions, of the fact that the energy sector effectively was captured by the Russian interests back in 1997. I mean, in 1996, I mean, all the imports since the beginning was the Russian imports, but also distribution networks were basically captured and transferred against a so-called debt of Moldova, which was undervalued substantially, but the government at that time, this is a different story. So basically imports and distribution in Moldova were effectively captured. Then if you look at the ministry and the departments, Moldovan government, who have been handling the issue since, it was effectively captured. Yes. And one of the examples is the fact that Moldova in 2002, 3, and 4, and 5, under the communist government, provided subsidy for the extension of distribution at the interest of the Russian company, I mean Gazprom, yes, with the state preferential subsidy to those who would extend this and put it on the assets of the Moldova Gas or Gazprom. So this is one of the examples. And then actually the flow of the money that have been produced out of this effective capture of the energy sector in Moldova up until now, it's only now there is discussion of destabilization, was materialized in the influences of the political life in Moldova on both sides, on the center and on the left, through bribery and some of the political parties who have been protecting the political rent out of this energy sector. And that had a huge, in my understanding, we would have had completely different political elites in Moldova if we hadn't been dependent so much on the energy sector in Moldova. And that has been one of the parts of the strategy of Russia to keep Moldova under the influence and dominate the political elites. Again, my understanding of both on the right and on the left of Moldovan spectrum, political spectrum.
And this gas, these are 1-year contracts from what I understand that go December to December from Gazprom every year. So this new pipeline and the plan from connecting gas from Romania to Moldova is really important.
Let me just add here, I'm shaking my head because this just shows how outrageous Gazprom is. Yeah. And now they are trying the same trick with regard to Ukraine. So Gazprom tries to charge Ukraine for the gas they export to occupy Donbass. But since Ukraine doesn't import any gas from Russia at all, it's not really possible to claim that. And I think that this is the only solution, as both of you really here suggest, that Moldova needs to take its gas from Romania and forget about Gazprom, yes, which is what the 3 Baltic states are yes, doing now. And Gazprom is giving up its pipelines yes, in yes, the 3 Baltic states. Too small for big Gazprom to bother about. And I think that it's true also of Moldova. Gazprom doesn't really want it. It just wants to be a nuisance, and you don't need such a supplier.
Yeah, and that's why the third energy package was ratified, and Moldova now entered into now a couple of years already adopted the law and started to demonopolize both imports but also distribution. Yes. And you can imagine what is the stake, how high the stake is, because once you basically remove one of the heaviest leverages that you have had against Moldova for 20-25 years, you can imagine the intensity of the battle. And sometimes actually different groups, political groups around these issues, intentionally, consciously, and unconsciously being part of some of the influences that is still being projected by Russia. And that should be, I mean, I think a clear understanding of this is the kind of I mean, the core issue that Moldova should really get rid of and implement it. And the efforts of the government in this particular area should be specifically supported by investments from the West, from the Americans, Romanians, Europeans, because I mean, of course, Moldova will demonopolize the internal market,
yes.
but Moldova needs investment to fill in the gap that will be created.
Yes. Yes.
That's real help, and that will denounce the leverage that Russia has, and it will be more of the state and the society back in the hands of the people of Moldova.
And interestingly, 6 billion that Russia claims from Moldova coincide exactly with the amount Rosneft, also another Russian company, gave to Venezuela, to Maduro's regime. And that shows how amazingly they're wasting so much money around the world, and that makes Putin's regime very vulnerable as being money the source of their power. So they're so rich, and that's their problem, and that's the problem of the world, because the world accepts to buy goods from them, to make them rich, and they support various regimes like Transnistria and Maduro's in Venezuela.
Yes. Well, this is a hot topic, and certainly not exclusive to Moldova whatsoever. Common across Central and Eastern Europe. I'd like to open up now to the audience, and maybe when you speak up, please introduce yourself, your name and your affiliation, and ask a question. And hopefully a brief question. There's one question right over there, so we can get many in, please.
Yes, hello, I'm Robert Lofter. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hello. I'm Robert Lofter, and I'm CEO of the Eco Catalyst Foundation. We like to think of ourselves as an old friend of Moldova. We've been involved in Moldova for over 10 years supporting environmental NGOs. In the early years, we were burned by a corrupt executive director of an NGO in Moldova, but we didn't give up on Moldova because we believe in the Moldovan people and we understand the difficulties that they face. And so we stayed our commitment. And we're happy to say we've been supporting for over 7 years Centrul Național de Mediu, which is focused on bringing clean water to Moldova using a grassroots democracy building approach. So I, as a friend of Moldova, we would suggest two things, and they're difficult, and that is embrace civil society. It's not easy to listen to civil society. It's not easy to listen to nonprofits, but they also care about Moldova, and we would encourage the government to engage with the Council of NGOs and to listen to them. They are really doing great work in Moldova, so we would very much like to encourage that. The other thing is to really embrace the rule of law and anti-corruption. Several winters ago, friends of Moldova gathered at the Chamber of Commerce. Actually, it was in the middle of a snowstorm. Prime Minister Leanca was there. And the corporate heads, people from government, people from NGOs, said that the biggest obstacle really to development in Moldova is the lack of rule of law and corruption. And we know that's very difficult to address, but we would encourage that. Lastly, also we understand the difficulties that Moldova faces with social media, Soviet Union. Back in 2014, Sergio and I went up to Capitol Hill and briefed congressmen and senators, their staff, about the dangers of hybrid warfare, social media being used as a tool of aggressive Russian policy. And I find it ironic that now we have experienced it firsthand here in the United States. So I feel that we in the United States, to paraphrase President Kennedy back in his Berlin speech, that we're all Moldovans. So I feel like we even come closer to Moldova now. So we know what you're facing. So I would just encourage, again, just to embrace these two difficult areas, engaging with NGOs, and also focusing on the rule of law and anti-corruption.
Okay, well, thank you for your comment. And if we can get another question then, and if you want to save any response for together, please, over here.
Thank you for talk. I'm Hiroshi Yamazaki. I do research in Japan for National Institute for Defense Studies. I'd like to ask Mr. Ostaf, and if possible, I'd like to have comments from Mr. Fairbank as well. I'm interested in Russian ways of some propaganda and some influence in the society, and you mentioned the media offensives. I do understand this is a serious problem, but I don't understand whether it makes a big change. People saw the tragedy in Ukraine. People know that this is a Russian propaganda. People elected the Democratic Party, and it makes a better change for the better way. So does it make a very big change, or is it not a short-term problem but a long-term problem?
So the question, how significant or critical is this problem of propaganda? Does that really, sway policies? And another question, maybe we can collect another question over here.
Hello, I'm Pamela Smith, former U.S. ambassador to Moldova, and still find it very close to my heart. This is a follow-on question to the last one, actually. Could you speak a little bit about Moldovan public opinion now? And is it shifting toward the east or toward the west? And how do we know, and how fast is this trend going? Thank you.
Very good. Very interesting question. So please.
On the last question, it's a very targeted and specific question, so easier to answer. The last IRI report survey have shown that actually over the last 8 months, I think from March 2017 to the September-November 2017, so the last 7-8 months, there was a shift towards more positive perspective of the West and European integration, which stands at 49% as against 43-42% of the customs union process, let's say, of the perception.
So 49% against the Eurasian customs union.
Yes, so there is a 7% increase of the preferential positive perspective. In the past, in the last, I think, 2.5 years, the public surveys have shown that there is a difference between 2 to 3%, sometimes in favor of the pro-European, sometimes customs union. But in 2010, it was like more than 50% of support to the European Union. I think the result, the causes, of course, hypotheses are that first is the quality of the governance of pro-European integration is an important role in advancing and explaining and building up the positive integration, and the government is responsible for doing that. The second hypothesis is that even if the government delivers, there is a propaganda that shifts public agenda and shifts actually the perception. And here comes the answer, my answer to the other question. And I think these two hypotheses should be dealt together and understood. In Moldova, there are 3 ways of getting and projecting Russian propaganda in Moldova. We've discussed a bit earlier about the audiovisual council, which is dominated, and there are some responses of the government in this sense. But the social media is totally unregulated, as it is in other countries, and the quality of the response against manipulations and the like is, the government and the groups within the Moldova, or there are no specialized agencies in Moldova that would at least trace the degree of the misuse of the information, fake news, or shaping agenda, or, there was an anecdotal evidence when the US Millennium Corporation has built the road from Chisinau to Soroca, and 2-3 months later on, people would be doing some sociological surveys, and the people living on both sides of the river of the road would say that actually Russia who has built this road. You can imagine the way how effectively sometimes they act. This is one example. But with this kind of domination of audiovisual council, social network, the degree of the shaping, ability to shape the public discussion agenda is substantial. Once you are capable of shaping the public agenda, public issues, which are discussed and considered to be dominant, of course, I mean, this is actually the power of the media, the level of the media that Russia has in Moldova. Of course, they can insert and you can dominate and divert public attention from one issue to another one, or transform actually the issue from the one which is authentic to another one. So, and then the final one is the way how they are able of controlling the third way of distribution of information on the ground, meaning door-to-door, house-to-house distribution of information. You have, the pro-Russian parties have a large network of the cells around the country, and they can deliver from newspapers to rumors about whatever. I mean, there was a recent rumor that I heard about that actually with the international investments, the international investors will come and buy all the land of Moldova, and will start, and basically Moldovans will not be in the hands of their own country. This is actually delivered by the rumors on the ground level, by the cells of the Socialist Party, before it was Communist Party, but also our party, so-called. So this is kind of the degree of their strategy. It's a very sophisticated one, and it does produce the influence on the people's
same narratives on land in the Baltic states as well.
Oh,
so
yeah?
Yes, same narrative. Roman, you wanted to jump in a bit, and then
just
we'll...
a short comment. The Soviet citizen was designed to live in a propaganda. So an entire state institution worked for that, and the ruling party worked and paid close attention that you raised and listen to the propaganda. That's why they're very sensitive, which may sound absurd to someone. Whenever they hear in their native language these orders to obey to some ideas and to take some ideas, they do that. And most of people who are pro-Western, they have no idea about details. They just live in this dream and follow the objectives exposed by announced by Russian, and they mostly watching TV. So we have this slow past, but through TV shows, through jokes, through a lot of other subtle tools and mechanisms, Russian Federation controls our TV space. That's why it's so influenced. There is a small margin of undecisive that are deciding the way Moldova goes. So I think we should do much more in order to keep with the European course integration and the Russian Eurasiatic Union. It's a political union. It doesn't have any interest. It was decided in half a year in 2011, and in half a year it was enforced. It's not like other trade areas or customs union, like European Union, NAFTA, many others that have at the core the economic interests of the region. We don't have any economic interest in Russian Federation, yes. Because others may argue that we export vegetables, we export some agricultural products. Yes, we do that, but we with very low added margin, very bad quality, and that's not cannot be a source of growth of the economy.
Let's collect 2 more questions. So a lady right here, in the center.
Hi, my name is Elena Dragalin, and I am from an American NGO, Moldova Aid, that works with the Moldovan diaspora in the United States, and also the organizer of Moldovan American Convention that serves as a platform for Moldovan diaspora in the US. I have a very short question for the experts that came here from Moldova. During this hour and a half, we heard about the positive changes that happened in Moldova in the past 2 years. My question is, what is the approval rate of the governing parties today compared to the approval rates that were before the election of 2014? In other words, how do people see the positive changes?
Yeah. This is, I think it's a good question to understand actually where the Moldovan government stands in terms of the trust of the people. Given the 2015 and 16 financial banking crisis and devaluation of Moldovan lei and the like, there was a political crisis and there was a confrontation within the so-called pro-European coalition government. So at this point of time, the trust in specifically in 2016 and 17 has decreased substantially. So it stands at like 10-15%. Some of the individuals within the government have more of the recognition. The prime minister, I think the last poll showed I think something like 20-25%, but the trust of the other politicians is much lower, like between 5 and 6%. As comparing to 2013-14, of course, it's a big difference. This is the result of the, as I will explain, of the financial banking crisis and later on the confrontation that existed. Well, I was recently reading actually the report on the quality of the governance in Netherlands. What I discovered is that if you look at the perception of the trust of the poorest quintiles of the Dutch society towards the government and the quality of the government, it was resembling almost identically situation in Moldova. So it means that if the society is poor, the trust of the poor within the more or less, let's say, democracy in transition is very much similar, like Moldova would reflect of the poorest quintiles perception of the Dutch society. But if you take the medium or the wealthiest part of the Dutch society, of course, they would have a different perspective of the government and the way how it delivers. So I think it's also very much a reflection of the poverty rate that Moldova became affected by the crisis and the like in 2015 and then 16, and that actually reflects on the quality and the perception of how much they trust the government. There is a bit of the positive trend, but of course it's way below that existed in 2014 and the like. Yeah.
But isn't it the same people that governed before 2014 and after 2014, -1 maybe?
It's if you look at the facts, in 2014, there were 3 political parties in government. There was Liberal Democratic Party with Prime Minister at that time Filat and then some other people. There was a Liberal Party with Gimpu, and then there was at that time Mr. Lupu with Democratic Party. Now in the government there is basically one political party and a fraction of Liberal Democratic Party. So actually there is part of that government in power now, but if you look at the quality and on the people, it's a different, let's say, setup. There's just a fraction of that. So
one political party.
Politically, it's one political party and a fraction of the other political party that was in the government.
Anders, do you want to jump in a little bit and think if I'll collect two more questions. So think about your questions and Anders.
The most successful reform countries, post-communist reform countries in the first decade after communism were Poland and the 3 Baltic states. They changed government, all of them, on average once a year. And all elections, this comes from the Bulgarian political scientist Ivan Krastyev, all elections in the early East European period were about corruption. Therefore, the sitting government is always losing because it's by definition responsible for the corruption. So this is a good cleansing thing, that you have governments being thrown out ever so often. Instability is not a bad thing if corruption is your main problem.
And if I may, we just underlined some of the, I would say, small positive elements. And there are huge problems that Moldova is facing. The judicial system, the investment, the climate, and you cannot pick just one element and reform one and you'll be successful in everything. You cannot build, for example, a democratic society on a poor economy, like we have $3,000 per capita. It's like building a castle on a sand. So every element is important. We appreciated the stabilization that happened, which is a small precondition for future jump and much deeper reform at a completely different scale.
Okay, our last two questions, gentlemen here and gentlemen following, and then you can respond to whichever feel fit.
Hi, my name is Bogdan Banu. I'm with the Romanian community of Washington, D.C. I have a question looking forward about the election law that was recently passed, which was, let's say, a little bit controversial and did not receive the international approval that I think was desired for something that was looking for a standard of democratic norm. How would that impact the government, and how would that relate with the current president, which I have not heard being mentioned into your discussions here, and how that has strained the relations with Romania, with the European Union, and I think with what would be the traditional allies of Moldova if we're looking forward into a Western orientation for the country.
And if we can collect the second question straight away.
Hi, thank you for this panel. My name is Chirca. I'm with Invest. It's an investment manager. To what extent is there a genuine consensus among the pro-Western political elites to fundamentally change away from an oligarchic system to a modern, open, free market system? And I ask this because in my mind, it matters very little, whether people are pro-Western or pro-Russian if they're not actually committed to, changing the structure of the system. Yeah. Thank you.
Who would like to? Go ahead, Roman.
Yeah, with the oligarchs, that's a phenomenon very characteristic with the post-Soviet societies, with the period accumulation of the capital which happened. We wake up in a new country, and we are told that now we are capitalist and democratic society. And the rush for gold started in a completely in a lack of institutions and rules. So that's why the oligarchs, they grew up, they went to political parties, and now most of the political parties, they have a group of people behind that. And in many times their primary economic conflict is most relevant for them, important than any ideological confrontation. So some of them distance themselves from any political or economical influence, but in our society we know who stands in most of the parties. That's as we began this session, without solving the problem of property, without passing through assessing who is the owner of the assets in Moldova, passing through an amnesty, legalizing the property, we will not be able to take this function from the political party to maintain the property, to maintain the assets. So, and we will, without that, we cannot have a political system with pure ideological confrontation. I'm not idealist. I know that there is no such a thing as pure ideological confrontation in a political life, but still with much less insignificant economic influence on oligarchs. That's how we'll get it. And another thing that has to happen, it has to happen at the level of the region. Yes. In Moldova, we tried several times. In a vacuum. Yeah, we tried that in many ways, and we realized that unless other much a major phenomena has to happen in order for us to pass to the next phase, or an agreement, reach an agreement between oligarchs. Those agreements will be the first laws of a new state, and after that, those laws will be passed to the citizens. Yes.
Since we're really, I think, tight for time, I'd like someone to take the question on the new electoral law. And then we will take a break. So,
there were a lot of discussions on the electoral law. What counts is actually the evidence-based approach and understanding what would be the impact of the mixed system on the pluralism of the political competition in Moldova. I don't think there is any evidence at all exists whether the mixed system will help strengthening pro-European integration process or not. This is I understood actually your question is, and I would love to speak on more on that issue, but I think I would try to attack specifically your question whether the mixed system will help the pro-European, let's say, integration or not. And here, and I mean, I've been interested in this issue for many years. What some of the elements of evidence I found is, in Moldova, that if you look at who people elect on the local level, mayors and local deputies or councillors, you have 80% those who are elected on the local level are the pro-European mayors or political parties. I was trying to find an answer why. My answer to that is because there is a direct link between Western supported infrastructure projects on the local level to the citizens. And citizens on the local level elect people who are capable of transforming their day-to-day life, water, education and the like, with the support of the international infrastructure projects. That means political parties in Moldova, this is the fact, are very much dominated by the interest, vested interest of some of the groups. Whereas, so people have become very distrustful to the political parties, and they are trusting like 6% of the political parties, given different developments. What people are trusting is actually the individuals who can change their life on a local level. So the elements of majoritarian system, in a particular context in Moldova, I'm not speaking about extending it to, might have more of the positive impacts because there would be more, and I hope it will continue, the infrastructure investment from the West, from the US, European, and the like, that will bring and make a closer connection between the people. So the majoritarian component dimension have a potential, I don't think that it will guarantee, have a potential of bringing more of the pro-European individuals who are thinking in terms of the particular specific benefits of the people to the country. So this is my answer in terms of the struggling with finding the particular answer to the question that you put forward. But otherwise, there is a more extended answer to the mixed system and the influence on Moldova.
Well,
just the final one, I mean, there is a perception in Moldova that there is people, not in Moldova, in general, that people don't underestimate the so-called collective Russian oligarch of Moldova. If you control 100% of energy, if you control a good, I mean, in 2014, that was the starting point, like more than 60% of the banking sector. If you control through the intermediaries, not just one individual, as it was in Ukraine, where you had Akhmetov, you had Chirca and the like. In Moldova, they had a different strategy through intermediaries, and and it would be controlled overall by the people within embassy and the like. That was the collective Russian oligarchy Moldova present, the most capable of influencing the situation in Moldova. The best answer is, of course, to demonopolize and creating conditions for investments, including for Russian investment, if so be, right? And this is and answering to the question to what degree the other political parties are committed to demonopolization, de-oligopolization, putting in place strong institutions, competition council, to fight the agreements and the like. I think this is the issue has to be demonstrated by all political parties, by the government, but also the opposition political pro-European parties, putting it as a top priority in de-oligarchization, by demonopolization, de-oligopolization, and bringing strong institutions in place to fight the oligarchic system in Moldova.
This may be the most
transparency, yes.
And this may be the most difficult task at hand. This has been a fascinating discussion. I think not often here in Washington we get such depth of expertise on Moldova, and I really appreciate our panel for sharing our thoughts with us today. I hope we can continue the conversation during break. I think we're just getting wound up right now. And we'll meet back here at 11 o'clock, or maybe we'll get at 11 o'clock, right, after a brief break, to discuss more the security situation in the region. Thank you so much, and let's give a hand of applause.
Good morning. My name is John Herbst. I am the director of the Dinu Patriciu Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for coming for our second panel today on Moldova. This concerns Moldovan security issues and Black Sea security. We have an excellent panel, and I will not waste your time telling you who's on the panel. You see their names, you have their program, distinguished folks, and we'll get right into our discussion. And we'll start with the Deputy Speaker of the Radu, Mr. Leanca, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. It's good to be back here at the Council at the Atlantic Council, and I decided to focus on three elements. Where were we in terms of security challenges back in 2014, and why I took 2014 as a reference point, because I was here in March of 2014 discussing about the same issues, challenges to Moldova's security and challenges to the region. Then my second very short comments will be about what has changed since 2014, for worse and for better. And third quick analysis will refer to what are the solutions to the challenges which we face. Again, having the privilege to be here in March of 2014, of course, then we had more or less similar challenges. It was exactly after the annexation of Crimea, after the beginning of the war in Donbass. So basically, we were witnessing the demolishing of the already fragile Euro-Atlantic security architecture. We were in a situation when we again understood that any security arrangement beyond NATO doesn't work. Budapest Memorandum didn't help at all to preserve Ukraine's integrity and sovereignty. And we were witnessing a much more aggressive Russian Federation, eager to use force also in its so-called neighborhood. If you look at the positive developments since March 2014, for Moldova, at least in terms of developing its security, of course, we have to recall that in that year, we signed the association agreement and the free trade zone with the European Union. We brought the visa-free regime. Thus, Moldova became an associated country. And of course, it left a strong impact on the way we behave, on the way our trade is developing. It was already mentioned that 65% of our trade goes towards the European Union, which means a very advanced level of integration. The Ukrainian crisis also has its positive aspects for Moldova. Today someone mentioned in the first panel that in 2013 a military Russian convoy came to Transnistria, transiting Moldova, Ukrainian territory, and I have to tell you that we learned only post factum about this transit. Of course, now it would be completely impossible to imagine something like this. So the ability of Russian Federation to use its military factor in Transnistrian region because of the developments in Ukraine have, of course, much smaller right now. So there are also some other benefits of having these new realities in Ukraine. But of course, our biggest interest is to see Ukraine in a much more stable and secure situation. On the negative, as I mentioned, the more aggressive Russian Federation, which imposed on us sanctions in 2014 using media in order to distort the perceptions, financing political parties in Moldova, conducting a very, so to say, civilized trade with us when only few companies have access to the Russian market, and those companies have to have links to the Socialist Party or to the Gagauz autonomy. Of course, before the Ukrainian crisis, usually the Western policies on the region, especially in Moldova, were driven bearing in mind the Russian factor. Now with the Ukrainian crisis or developing, we found ourselves in a new situation. We are overshadowed by Ukrainian developments. Everyone is so much focused on Ukraine, how to help Ukraine, militarily, build in terms of defense capacities, in terms of overcoming the economic crisis. And again, we are a bit, unfortunately, sidelined. And of course, unfortunately, our own failures also contributed to, of 2015, Speaker Candu already referred to it, contributed to this diminishing attention. And as we all know, less attention from the West means less political support, less money, less commitment to engage us. So all these factors contributed to additional challenges Moldova is facing. And if in 2014, and here I would stop about the comparison, if in 2014 we were discussing about application for membership to the EU, and it's not just about money, it's not just about joining a trade, economic and military and political union, it's about also geopolitics. Unfortunately now it's much more difficult to discuss about these issues, not just because of Moldova, it's also because of the crisis, Brexit, refugees, and some other problems within the EU, but again, it's much more difficult. So here, where Moldova finds itself today, in a rather new context, and of course the question what to do and how to help Moldova. In the first place, I believe we need to rebuild the image, and by rebuilding the image, to rebuild the trust which we used to have in the West, but also at home from our society. And we all know that it's much more difficult to rebuild the trust and confidence than to build it from scratch as it was in 2009. But again, we don't have an alternative to it. How to rebuild the trust in two ways. First, to conduct the reforms at home, focus on independent institutions, accountable institutions, giving more arguments to our friends in the West. And second, of course, by a better communication, because I think that we haven't done a good job in the last 2-3 years in this respect. Being here in the US and the Atlantic Council, I want to thank very much you, dear colleagues, and the think tank as such for keeping Moldova on the screens, because that's our, again, big problem. So we need, in our relations with the United States, to focus very much on this strategic dialogue, which was enacted in 2014 in March. But unfortunately, we failed somehow to put enough emphasis and make it working. And it has three elements, three dimensions: security and defense, which is key; energy, which is another very important area; and trade. We will discuss, I'm sure, about NATO. Here, I think that what we need to do is to follow the logic of pre-accession. So to focus again on interoperability, on standards, on discussing with NATO more what you have launched in 2014 on the military defense capacities of Moldova. Hopefully soon we will pass the strategy on military defense, and we will be able to move to the second phase. A lot has to be done, I'll finish very quickly, in our relations with Romania. Again, through Romania, together with Romania, it's a path towards the European Union, towards the Western world. So starting from energy, interconnection, infrastructure, in peacekeeping, maybe peacekeeping battalion, which could serve in various EU operations abroad and NATO. Ukraine, a lot has been done on the Transnistrian segment of the Moldovan-Ukrainian border. For the first time, we have a joint customs and border control, which is addressing the flux of illegal of smuggling, illegal trafficking, and things like this. But still, a lot has to be done. And the biggest challenge in order to ensure our security, of course, is to make sure that we are able to win next year elections, and then to focus again on domestic aspects, on our institutions, and this way to build the resilience at home, but also to make sure that we continue to the pro-Western path.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you so much. First of all, let me say hi to all of you on behalf of Prime Minister Filip. He's also involved in quite an interesting security conversation, this time back at home in Moldova. Tomorrow we'll be seeing the well-expected launch of the NATO liaison office back in Chisinau. So it's an important moment, even in a history of a neutral country, according to its constitution. So I'll do my best not to duplicate any of the messages that have been spelled out already. We've been looking at the past in the comparison to the present. Let us look a little bit at the trends. I'll be focusing more on issues that have to do both things stand on the merits in terms of politics and also in terms of stratcom, because strategic communications, as opposed to propaganda, disinformation, other malignant information influence operations done by the Russians in the region, is key for the government. This government did not come on an easy path or with some easy tasks. Speaking of strategic communications, we have stamped from the very beginning the policy efforts in parallel with the communications ones. So 2016 was Operation Stabilization, the year of stability. 2017, the year of growth and investment. And this has been delivered in terms of economics. Speaking of trends, 2018 is the year of irreversible reforms. There are several reasons for that. First of all, the fact that we're trying to reverse a cycle, whereas periodically, due to fatigue with one camp, the other camp comes in. So after multiple years of pro-EU, Western-minded governance, there is momentum right now for the other side. This momentum can be stopped, of course, democratically by a coalition next November. And I think one of the key messages also on behalf of the government is the need for wisdom among pro-European parties, whether in power and in opposition, to make sure they secure a coalition in the next year after elections. Separate from that, how is Russia present? Because whether you like it or not, you have to talk about the elephant in the room. How is Russia present in Moldova? First of all, I think everybody is well aware that Russian propaganda is quite present. Interesting is not a lot of, let's say, Moldova manufactured content, also because they've got the audience in a way caught to watching already Russian television. So it's not by chance that efforts by the parliamentary majority have been done in the sense of, while respecting democratic governance and rules already existing in the international organizations that Moldova is part of, you can do some kind of a elegant containment of that malignant influence. By the way, today the parliamentary majority voted anti-propaganda legislation, so this is a step forward. Will be very interesting in seeing reactions. The second way, speaking of reactions in which Russia is very present, is by targeting Moldovan officials. Whether we're talking about harassing them on airports in Moscow or other kinds of information operations abroad, you should be well aware that the main purpose that we're seeing as a trend for the next year is to diminish the credibility of pro-Europeans in Moldova. Whether we're talking about the pro-Europeans in power or the pro-European side of opposition, please do double check some of the news you may be seeing in the media in the months to come. Because interesting operations are going on right now promoted by Moscow, either directly or via proxies. We have talked in the previous panel about Transnistria. From this perspective, there's not a lot of things which could be added. I would just spell out the fact that when there is a strong regional cooperation, things move forward. And when there is a willingness in Chisinau, Tiraspol knows, looking also at the quality of regional cooperation between Moldova, Ukraine, and Romania, that they have to move in. It would be interesting to see Moscow's reply to recent development in terms of Transnistria, so we should be watching that. There has been progress. Also, I believe Prime Minister Kurz said in Vienna at the OCC meeting that there have been consistent progress in the past few weeks. We're looking forward for such a pattern in the months to come. Last but not least, let us look also at not having regrets in December or January next year. It's really bad when you tend to have regrets and say, we could have done so much to prevent things. And let us not underestimate the capacity for disruption of Russia's return in town in Chisinau end of next year. That will disturb people back in Bucharest, in Kiev, and most of all the Moldovan citizens. And that will be all on my side for the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Verspa.
Okay. I was going to talk about what NATO is doing in the Black Sea region and also then about the NATO-Moldova partnership. Black Sea, of course, is where all the Russian aggression has actually been taking place in the last several years. Yet since up until 2014, NATO didn't attach a very high priority to the region. while NATO naval forces made periodic visits and we had the sea breeze exercises. On the whole, NATO was much more focused on planning for out-of-area operations, especially Afghanistan. But of course, the Russians have never been idle in the region, and today the Black Sea is what you can call the nexus of Russia's strategy for reestablishing hegemony over its southern neighborhood, using disruption and destabilization rather than mutually beneficial cooperation. And of course, Russia has taken advantage of its illegal occupation of Crimea to engage in a massive military buildup, which has substantially altered the balance of power in the region. Occupied Crimea has become one of these bastions for Russia's anti-access and area denial capabilities that give Russia the ability to impede movement of regional forces and disrupt NATO's efforts to reinforce allies' defenses. And of course, as we all know, the Kremlin continues its undeclared war in eastern Ukraine, its creeping annexation of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and its interference in Moldova's internal affairs, both directly and through the Transnistrian puppet regime. And indeed, the whole hybrid toolkit is being applied and will certainly be applied even more aggressively as the elections draw near. So what is NATO doing? What should NATO be doing in the region? While the efforts to strengthen NATO's deterrence posture have been focused more on the eastern flank, on the Baltic states and Poland, where the greatest vulnerability lies, and where we've been finished deploying these multinational battle groups. NATO has also given increased attention to the Black Sea, especially since the 2016 Warsaw Summit. While there was not a perceived need to put permanent or rotational battle groups in the southeastern flank, allies have agreed to deploy what's called the tailored forward presence in southeastern Europe, which includes a multinational brigade led by Romania, with Bulgaria and others contributing, which achieved its initial operating capability in April. And this is serving as the vehicle for more frequent rotational deployments and exercises, some involving the new U.S. Armored Brigade Combat Team that's based in Poland. There's been an increase in AWACS surveillance flights and combined air training. NATO naval forces are making more regular visits to the Black Sea as part of a new combined maritime framework. And allies have just agreed to establish a Black Sea coordination cell at NATO's Maritime Command in the UK, with the hope that this could be relocated to the region once the three allies who are littoral states can agree on who's going to host, which is not an easy question. So I think taken together, these measures have reassured NATO's eastern allies and bolstered deterrence along the southeastern flank. But clearly this is a continuing challenge. More needs to be done to fully offset the Russians' buildup in the region and their demonstrated readiness to use force, as we've seen in Georgia and Ukraine. Now, NATO isn't just defending itself. Allies recognize that we can't just circle the wagons and strengthen our own deterrence posture. We also need to bolster the capabilities of Russia's neighbors, like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, who are threatened by Moscow and whose sovereignty, territorial integrity are a strategic interest of the alliance. We have much more massive efforts of assistance going on with Ukraine and Georgia. We have the substantial NATO-Georgia package agreed in 2014 and a comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine with resident defense advisors in Tbilisi and in Kiev. But we did recognize the challenges facing Moldova, and at the Wales Summit in 2014 launched a defense capacity building initiative with Moldova as one of the first recipients. And I think this is sorely needed, even though Moldova was a founding member of the Partnership for Peace in 1994 and has joined some of the other dimensions of the partnership agenda. Internal political instability and minuscule defense budgets have limited the impact of NATO partnership activities in Moldova. Defense spending, of course, is roughly 1/3 of 1% of GDP, which doesn't leave any money for procurement. So clearly a challenge for Moldova going forward will be to devote more resources to defense. But there have been some success stories. Since the launch of this defense capacity building program, NATO has helped in developing a new national security strategy and a national defense strategy. and in designing a suitable force structure for the future Moldovan armed forces. This is part of the first phase and will lay the basis for more direct assistance in professionalization of Moldovan armed forces. Moldova's participated in some specific programs that are helping with the training of NCOs, rooting out corruption in defense resource management. That's the Building Integrity Program. And through the Science for Peace and Security program, Moldova has managed to create a cyber defense lab and conduct some useful projects on counterterrorism, chemical and biological defense, and telemedicine. And also positive is the contribution by Moldova of about 40 troops to the KFOR operation in Kosovo, an infantry maneuver platoon and an explosive ordnance disposal team. And this has not only helped with interoperability, but has been a way to demonstrate Moldova's potential to be an exporter of security in Southeastern Europe. So I think we have a foundation on which Moldova can build more capable and professional armed forces under democratic civilian control, increase its resilience against Russian direct and hybrid aggression, and contribute to wider collective security efforts in the Black Sea region, if that is the goal of Moldova's people and its leaders. I know that it's the goal of the new defense minister, whose appointment was obstructed for 11 months by President Dodon. And I certainly hope that the misguided anti-NATO sentiments of the president and other politicians, which have impeded some aspects of NATO cooperation to date, will not remain a continuing obstacle to progress. As was mentioned, starting tomorrow, NATO will have a full-time liaison office in Chisinau, which will be officially opened by my successor, Rose Gadamuller. The office's main role is to carry out more robust and sustained public diplomacy to highlight the benefits of cooperation with the alliance and to help counter both the president's and the Russians' anti-NATO propaganda. The bottom line of NATO's message is that building modern, interoperable armed forces in accordance with NATO standards will strengthen Moldova's security and regional stability, and is fully compatible with Moldova's status as a neutral country per the Constitution. But ultimately, it's not NATO that can make the sale, it's the Moldovan leaders and authorities themselves who have to win this debate. So I hope internecine squabbling can be brought to an end, and that the Moldovans will make the case themselves for a closer partnership with NATO and for at least becoming more aligned with NATO, even if membership is not the ultimate trajectory in the case of Moldova.
Thank you, Sandy. We've had a good discussion thus far on security. Now talk to Dr. Shaffer. We'll talk about the energy side of security.
Well, actually, Moldova's energy security challenges and its national security challenges are really interlinked, and I believe that the solution to either of them is inseparable. So I'll start with 7 major energy security challenges that Moldova has. One, it's one of the most gas-intensive markets in the world. About 66% of its total energy supplies come from natural gas. This is very good in terms of environmental impact. It's very good in terms of climate emissions. But of course, natural gas is much more challenging to have a robust and reliable system than other sources of fuels. Second, Moldova is a landlocked state, which means it can't access LNG. Even its oil supplies have to go through neighboring states. It limits many of its options. Moldova, despite this high penetration of natural gas in its market, has no natural gas storage in its own territory. And in fact, even its main power station is outside the de facto jurisdiction of the central government. Almost all of Moldova's gas supplies come from one supplier, and as was pointed out in the previous panel, not only is Gazprom the main supplier of gas, but it's present along the whole supply distribution line in Moldova, including ownership stakes in grids and in supply lines. And in fact, even one of the positive aspects of Moldova's energy security situation, the fact that it's a major transit state of Russian gas, may end in 2020, and this challenge is in front of it as well.
Also compounding Moldova's energy security challenges is the fact that the biggest sector that consumes energy in Moldova is actually the residential sector, which is different than most other countries. And so thus, this sector isn't interruptible, meaning that if you have some sort of supply disruption, it's not like a fertilizer factory in Latvia or a cement factory in Israel, where you basically can close down about 20% of the energy demand to a sector that doesn't really feel strategic damage. In Moldova would basically be the public. Okay, so what's the good news, right, after all those 7 points? One, I think if you study the national security, energy security strategy of Moldova to 2030, and you look at most of the legislation in place, you see that Moldova has a very high level of professionalization among its civil servants, especially dealing with energy. And in fact, we see that here on these two panels, the level of articulation, of professionalism. So basically, Moldova does have the people that can solve this quandary. And this quandary, actually, despite all these different points of limitations, actually being a very small market, the small scope of the Moldovan energy market actually lends it to something that can be solved. Almost like a good city planner can, really make a very big difference in people's lives. In a small country like Moldova, proper planning of the energy infrastructure can make a dramatic shift. So how do we go forward? And part of the big way that Europe has been, and I think also the U.S. as well, has been emphasizing how does Moldova move forward, is to adopt EU legislation through its commitment in the energy community. And in fact, if you read this legislation, it's almost utopia. So if you're in the center of Europe and you have all these options and you have all this storage and you have infrastructure, let's just remember in Europe, most of their major energy infrastructure was built by national oil and gas companies. It didn't start with the market producing infrastructure. It had infrastructure, and eventually the market built on this infrastructure that was built by governments, right? So what we're asking a country like Moldova to do, and Georgia as well that's joined, in Ukraine, we're saying that even without infrastructure, you have to have a market first, and hopefully that market will build infrastructure. And I actually really like in the energy security document to 2030 that Moldova pushes back and says, well, this is very nice, but first thing, we might have to actually, the state, build some infrastructure, and we can put a market on that. And I think it's very important that Europe and the United States listen to the decision makers in Moldova. I think they're much more aware of the specific challenges in Moldova. And I encourage decision makers that are here in this room to push back, because this utopian version, we don't even know if it's going to work in Europe, in the center of Europe, let alone in Europe's periphery. And I think this is also in the case of funding. You see, for instance, that we discussed in the earlier panel, this really strategic pipeline, gas pipeline, the first interconnection of coming in from Romania into Moldova. But actually, the international financial institutions have put stipulations that first Moldova has to liberalize its market but before it can actually get the most crucial piece of this infrastructure. Actually, let it get the infrastructure, and the market liberalization will be much easier. How do you liberalize a market with one player? How do you liberalize a market that actually really has so few consumers? We have to think about scale. We take American type thinking, where you have 1,000 major consumers in the Northeast United States, 300 producers, and you try to apply that to a small market like Moldova. A second would be building gas storage. And again, the private market doesn't usually do this well. Someone doesn't wake up one morning and say, when I'm an adult, I want to build gas storage. It's just usually not the dream of people. The government might need to do this themselves. And last point I would say, and this is interlinked to what's going on in the region, I think there is a lot of room for regional cooperation, and that yes, this new refounded security cooperation has to have an energy security element. In the 1990s, when we talked about, I remember we'd go to all these forums of Black Sea cooperation. This was a time of American dominance with close relationship between NATO and Turkey. And Black Sea cooperation almost seemed like sort of a luxury item. Gee, like it's like a fun, nice thing. Now it's a really essential item. I hope we hear. I'm glad we're in places like the Atlantic Council, but I hope we hear more about it in the U.S. Congress, in the White House. I think it's also an essential way to help repair the relationship between Turkey and the United States, because Turkey can play an extremely important role, obviously, or the major role in Black Sea security, and I think this is something where there's no separation of points of view between Turkey and the United States or Turkey and NATO on the Black Sea region. So I think for a variety of reasons, and again, this should be the wider Black Sea region, which would include non-littoral states like Moldova and like Azerbaijan. I think when you look at that bastion, you have a really important area that can really change regional security.
Brenda, thank you. I'll ask a few questions and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Brenda, both you and Speaker Leanca have spoken about regional cooperation. So let's talk about this for a moment. How do you see the regional cooperation in energy working specifically? Do you see, for example, Speaker spoke about a particular role for Romania. Do you see Romania having an important role in development of regional cooperation involving Moldova?
Right. So I would say first thing in terms of investments, and you see this in the energy security document of 2030, a lot of realism, which I really liked in the document, that the major investors could be countries like Turkey, countries like Azerbaijan, right? That maybe won't be investing in shale in the United States or in the Gulf of Mexico, but actually could have interesting investments or relevant investments in the region. So something like a gas storage facility in Moldova has strategic value, could overnight change their whole energy security situation. It's not that expensive, and you could find someone in the region who might want to invest in it. Also, something that's very interesting we can learn from is that in Moldova and also in Georgia, for instance, we have energy security that straddles the conflict zones that actually operates quite in cooperation. We have this with the hydroelectric dam that straddles the Abkhazian portion of Georgia. We have the same with the power plant in Transnistria. So there is a lot of cooperation happening around the energy infrastructure that could be a platform for further cooperation.
Okay, would you like to pick up on that, Mr. Speaker?
Just to answer your question about Romania's role in building this regional cooperation, I think Romania is able to play an important role, and it does play it. If we speak about this gas interconnection, I'm really happy to know that hopefully by the end of this year, there will be a decision about the investment which a Romanian publicly listed company will make into this interconnection from the border to Chisinau. So in this way, basically, we will be in kind of integrated chain from the gas producing, especially in the Black Sea, the discovery made by the American and the Austrian companies, transportation and the delivery to Moldova. If we speak about gas storage facilities, from what I know, to build one is indeed a very expensive thing. And I'm not sure whether the government of Moldova can afford to do something like this. But from what I also know, in Romania, so just on the other side of the Prut River, there are gas storages which are not used. So we could also discuss this issue with the Romanian government. And I'm sure that this kind of synergy would produce the cheapest, but also the most efficient results. And if you put everything in one perspective, the gas pipeline, together with these gas storage facilities, then we might have exactly the best option solution. And of course, we should not forget about electricity, because you rightly said that 70% of the generating capacity is on the left side of Dnistru. So we depend very much on the settlement of the Transnistrian conflict, and it's not on it's still on the horizon. It's not just within a few meters from us. Therefore, we need definitely to interconnect ourselves with the Romanian market, which is the European market, and to have the advantages of choosing what to buy, the gas or the electricity. And I hope very much that in 2-3 years we will be fully integrated, both in terms of gas as well as in terms of electricity, into the European market. And Romania, again, plays an important role.
Okay, one more point in this energy area. Brenda, you talked about energy as a way to sort of bring in Turkey, but of course, Russian-Turkish potential cooperation with various pipelines. How does that factor in here?
Yeah, I mean, Turkey's market, actually, you have gas coming from everywhere, from Russia to major projects from Azerbaijan, from Iran. Even Turkey in the times of crisis with Israel was still discussing and still continuing to discuss importing gas from Israel and from Cyprus. So I think that Turkey in many ways keeps the I wouldn't say keeps the geopolitics out of energy, but actually it's not an exclusive club. Meaning the fact that they're also engaging Turkish Stream, doesn't mean that it's in a different sector in Moldova that Russian influence would affect its decisions. So I think it's neutral in this respect.
Okay, Mr. Magdin, you also spoke about, as you said, when regional cooperation goes up, there are positive results. How do you see this now going forward in the security area?
Well, I think, let me start by what we see in terms of communications, and then we go into things on the merits.
Okay.
As you can see right now, there is periodic coordination, which you don't really see. At the same time, in Chisinau, you have the president is trying to mirror, in a way, all activities that the government is trying to do towards the West. He's mirroring this into Moscow. So whether he's there once per month or every 2 months, whether he's the only one invited to a parade or not, that's his thing and his agenda. He's trying to disturb regional cooperation, which we have been working quite a lot on at several levels, governmental, parliamentary, and so on. It's also in the interest of all the 3 countries in the close neighborhood there, namely Moldova and its 2 neighbors, Romania and Ukraine. Romania is an EU NATO country. Of course, it wants stable borders and has a special affection for Moldova. 2018 is going to be a particularly interesting year since, and this may be used by Russian propaganda for a lot of purposes, including in terms of demonizing regional corporations, because there will be at least 2 operations that we can spot already. One is Operation Disenchantment. Disenchantment on the 2 sides. The West should be disenchanted with people who run things in the region. Why? Because they're not good enough or they're not reforming enough. This will be one of the main narratives. And disenchantment on the other side, hey, the West doesn't care enough because, hey, look, Dodon is received by Putin, but you're not as well received in the West or received as many times as Dodon does his things with Russia. And this combined with subliminal message like the West may pivot or not strategically in the region, but hey, we're always here. We've been here in the 17th century, we're going to be here in 10 years, in 15 years, and so on. So this Operation Disenchantment is there and will continue. The second one, it's about using a symbolic here and try to derail things a little bit. Namely, the fact that there is a centenary anniversary in Romania, about Grand Romania. And so there will be pumped up messaging from Russia because Dodon needs an enemy as well about any issues relating to reunification, which is in fact a fake debate. So from this perspective, these are, let's say, the main troubling spots in terms of how to affect bilateral relationship with trilateral and regional consequences. As regards Ukraine, possibly they're going to try to say to create some kind of a split in between Eastern Partnership countries, either speculating on ideas that, like this has been the past for Romania and Bulgaria upon EU accession, NATO accession, somebody has to be better than the rest. As you all know, there is a periodic competition on saying who is the poster child of a specific format. So as long as this poster child issue is virtuous and we help each other in the region, it's great. If it's just being used to demonize 2 out of 3 countries, then it's not good. So from this perspective, and this may affect more Ukraine in the years that comes.
Okay, thank you.
Just one word about the regional cooperation and Moldova's role into it. When I first came to the US in '93, I was a bit surprised the way how Americans sometimes describe Moldova. Moldova as a country being sandwiched in between Ukraine and Romania. So as a country in between, of course, it is our best interest to have a very active, not just bilateral cooperation with Bucharest and Kiev, but to try to build an active trilateral cooperation, because it would have extremely positive effects on various issues. Energy. So far, both Ukraine and Moldova are not in this European transportation network system of electricity, the so-called ENSOE. So we need to discuss with Romania, but also with Ukraine, but also Romania and the EU, how we can become together or separately eventually, but I think there is some advantage also in getting together with Ukraine into this network. Look at this issue of the minorities. In Ukraine, there is a certain quite artificial division of the Moldovan and Romanian minority. We have Ukrainian minority. In Romania, there is an Ukrainian minority. I do believe that through this trilateral cooperation, we could in the most effective way address this issue, which sometimes, as we see what happened with the educational law in Ukraine, could trigger big unrest, and it's regretful. And I somehow believe that if we would have a more efficient trilateral cooperation, we could avoid certain effects of such legislation being put in place in Ukraine or eventually in Moldova. So again, we are very interested, especially Moldova, since it's in the middle, to develop this cooperation.
You mentioned one positive impact on Moldova of Russia's aggression in Ukraine was Ukraine closing the border for Russian supplies into Transnistria. How are the Russians now supplying their proxies?
They don't.
They don't.
Which is a good development.
So so therefore you see Chisinau's hands growing stronger in Transnistria.
Yes, indeed.
And is there a synergy between this development and visa-free in terms of your policy in Transnistria?
Well, visa-free regime is an element which helps us to build a better image, a better life, a better perspective for Moldovan citizens. Right. I think on the first panel, Serghei outlined that one element, one chance to settle in the future the Transnistrian conflict is by raising the living standards and giving a certain perspective. So the visa-free was exactly the positive development.
I was being too indirect. As a result of these developments, would you say the desirability of closer association with the rest of the country, with Moldova, is growing in Transnistria?
Well, I don't want to sound too optimistic.
Right.
I think the effect was so far minimal. Okay. It's not enough just to offer them this perspective, because they benefit from it. They can get Moldovan citizenship very easily. Okay. We need to give them also not just rights, but responsibilities. It will take some time.
Of course, I've not been ignoring the formidable Ambassador Vershbow. Sandy, you outlined very nicely growing NATO activities in the Black Sea region and how that will might impact on Moldova. But how do you see the Turkish angle of a growing NATO role in the Black Sea? How do we manage this?
It's a difficult issue. I mean, the bottom line is I think Turkey is going to continue to work to maintain its relationship with NATO despite its growing flirtation with Moscow, because it still wants the NATO security guarantee. It wisely, I think, doesn't see the cooperation with Russia as likely to last all that long. It's tactical on Putin's part. But at the same time, Turkey has its own vision for its role in the Black Sea and is unfortunately cautious about some of the initiatives that I've described in terms of expanding NATO's naval presence. They have the responsibility as the guardians of the Montreux Convention, and NATO does have to stick within the rules that are established by that. They've also had difficult bilateral relations for many years with Bulgaria, so agreeing on regional initiatives is not easy. Romania is a little bit more able to get along with all three than Turkey is. So it does make it a bit harder for NATO to counter the shift in the balance of power that has occurred. But I think Turkey does have an interest in the partnership relationship with Moldova, in part because of the Gagauz connection, but I think also that they do worry in the long term about growing Russian influence, and I think want to see all the neighbors of Russia become more resilient, more able to provide for their own defense and to take advantage of the partnership program. So I think at the end of the day, Turkey can be a factor for progress, and they certainly push for devoting more resources to these partnership programs than some of the Western European allies.
One of those tough talk show type questions. At the end of the day, will they go along with increased NATO naval presence in the Black Sea?
They will. I mean, they already have to some degree, but each activity has to be limited in duration to, I think it's less than a month under the Montreux Convention, and they're still wary about having some kind of NATO coordination cell in the region. They see that as leading to a longer-term presence than they're prepared to commit to right now. I think they want to keep options open, do what's necessary in the short term to show the flag and build some of the readiness and capability of NATO forces in the region, but balancing that with their growing relationship with Russia.
Romania has been enthusiastic in pushing for a greater NATO role in the Black Sea region. Where would you put Bulgaria right now?
I would say that they're very cautious, but have, over the last year since the Warsaw Summit, begun to come around. But they too are sensitive about a permanent presence in the region, and particularly they don't want to give their Romanian neighbors kind of the preeminent position in some of these initiatives. So it's very much a deliberative process.
Well, one last question, because again, this seems to me really interesting, and it might also be important. Is it possible that their desire not to let Romania steal too large of a march might make them more cooperative about their own role in hosting a cell or permitting ship visits and such?
The
Bulgarians.
Bulgarians? Perhaps. I think the U.S. needs to be more actively engaged in this, and I understand the administration is increasingly worried about the Russian A2AD capability in Crimea and the broader power projection capability that the Russians are already demonstrating with the Black Sea Fleet now as a key tool, not only in the Black Sea but in the Eastern Med. So I think the U.S. can play a healthy role and can try to find a balance between the three, sometimes neurotic allies in the region.
Your reference to the growing Russian demilitarization of Crimea and what this means for area denial, do you think this is also having an impact in Ankara, moving the Turks towards reconsidering perhaps some of their prerogatives in the Black Sea?
I haven't seen any evidence of that yet. For them, it's one step at a time. I think they understand that if push came to shove and they needed serious assistance from NATO, not just some of the discrete things that have been taking place over the last few years in terms of AWACS flights and Patriot missiles. If they need some significant reinforcement from the Allies, they too could be seriously jeopardized by the Russian A2AD capability. But they're just beginning to wake up to that.
I'll make one point here rather than just ask a question, and then you might agree or not. It seems to me that NATO missed an opportunity, and for that matter, the United States missed an opportunity when they shot down the Russian warplane in the fall of 15, and the Russians, growled, and NATO did speak up, but slowly and a little bit more softly than the Turks would have liked. I don't know. What if you'd comment on that? I realize you were in the saddle then, so.
Yeah, that was a awkward situation because exactly what were the circumstances leading up to the shoot-down were hotly debated. I mean, it's clear that the Russian plane did cross briefly into a little sort of finger of Turkish territory, but where the plane was actually shot down is more controversial, shall we say. So allies were a bit reluctant to embrace the Turks, and with the concern that this could encourage a repeat, which they desperately wanted to avoid at the time.
I remember well the debate over where it was, but what I also remember was the fact this is, I think, was the fourth incursion into Turkish airspace.
Yeah, and the Turks did warn the Russians.
Yes, every time.
They played the tapes in the North Atlantic Council with the pilots speaking in English, they also played some tapes of them talking in Russian, although it was not the most intelligible Russian, I have to say.
If I could jump in
Please.
here, another opportunity that was missed with Turkey, you know, and how we treat various NATO allies. 5 weeks until a senior U.S. official went to Ankara after the attempted coup. I mean, if this would happen in any other, you know, if this happened in the Netherlands or the UK or Spain, you know, you would have a U.S. official there overnight. The fact that it took 5 weeks did a lot of.
Although the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was there sooner, but political leadership should have gone earlier. That's absolutely a valid point.
Okay.
I would just say on this issue of regional cooperation, I think what I draw from some of the comments is that Moldova needs to kind of have a very diversified portfolio, not put all your eggs in one basket with your neighbors, even with NATO. You should have a robust bilateral cooperation program with the United States, given the ability of the skeptics within your society to exploit some of these issues. So a diverse portfolio would seem to me to be the safest way to go.
I'll make a comment and ask our two Moldovan colleagues here to comment. There's no question that there's a direct connection between domestic issues in Moldova and overall security for the country. To the extent that you're able to deal with, for example, Russian use of financial networks, money laundering and such, you greatly strengthen the country. Any comments you have on that, Mr. Speaker?
Well, I think you responded to your own question. It was a rather rhetorical one.
Perhaps.
Of course, it's well known that Russia is always using our weaknesses, institutional weaknesses, corruption which still exists, in order to pursue its policies. And well, I guess they used the Moldovan banks for this money laundering scheme, not just because they wanted to play some politics in Moldova, because they basically wanted to get out of Russia more than $20 billion, which probably then brought to US as well, to other Western European countries. So it was a direct help of Moldova for getting the Russian money to your countries. But again, the link is definitely there. That's why we always say that we need to continue the pro-Western integration, but also simultaneously to be much more effective in the reforms. And the reforms means stronger institutions, better and more accountable, building this resilience. And then I'm sure that the effectiveness of Russian meddling will be much, much smaller. Although it's still a long way for us to build this a more resilient society. So we cannot fight on our own just with this Russian aggression through its various forms. Therefore, of course, we need a much stronger dialogue with the US. That's why we're here. That's why we all mentioned, and yesterday on the Capitol Hill we had many discussions on how to strengthen this strategic dialogue and how to focus more on its various key elements. Again, I mentioned them already: defense and security. You help a lot Ukraine. Proportionally, we hope you will help Moldova as well, because we depend on Ukraine, but Ukraine also depends on us. If things change in Moldova after the next elections, we all can imagine what kind of blow for Ukraine's security and the stability in the region will happen. Therefore, we will be much more intense in coming here, in pleading with the Congress, with the State Department, the White House, but here, of course, we need your help. And I was very happy to hear what Damon Wilson said, that you will intensify your debates about Moldova and hopefully help us to get again in the front line of interest of various US institutions.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, Radu, do you want to address this at all?
Yeah, in a nutshell, talking about reforms. 2016 Operation Stabilization, basically modifying legislation that had to do with the banking system was key. Right. There would have been, in 2016, 2017, no developments with the IMF without properly addressing this. So the fact that there is right now an IMF agreement, it's due to the fact that the banking system is considered secure. And I think separate, let's say, from this official international rubber stamping, together with the resumption of funding from the EU, what's key is also a concrete victory which came a few weeks ago, namely speaking also about regional cooperation and the best ways also to do business. One of the biggest Romanian banks, Banca Transilvania, together together with the EBRD. They're basically doing a joint venture to buy one of the big banks in Moldova. So that also says a lot about trust, both in the country, in its private sector, and about the future.
Okay, thank you. Before we turn to Q&A, Brenda, is there anything you'd like to add?
I'm happy to hear from the audience
Okay,
questions.
that's good.
Yeah.
And Sandy, I'll give you the last word before we turn to the audience.
Well, we just reinforced the comments by my neighbors here. Clearly, the main threats to Moldova are not direct military aggression from Russia, although there's still potential to do mischief making with the forces, even if they're hard to resupply in Transnistria. But dealing with all the different dimensions of the Russian hybrid campaign, which will only intensify in the run-up to the elections, and taking advantage of the support you can get from NATO, from the EU, from the US on a bilateral level, and from Europeans as well. I think people recognize that there's a lot at stake, and Moldova's European trajectory is going to be on the line next year. And so I think this is a good time to make the case for more support. But ultimately, you have to do the hard work and particularly make those accountable institutions credible so that the Russians have fewer vulnerabilities to exploit.
A nice note to end this portion of the session on. Okay, questions? Please identify yourself.
I'm Asif Chaudhry, former U.S. Ambassador to Moldova. Just continuing the theme that started here a bit ago about missed opportunities. I just want to emphasize one thing, and that is, Ambassador Hurst, you mentioned Moldova's hand being strengthened after the Crimea issue, and of course the fact that the Moldovans have been standing up to the Russians. So here's another missed opportunity, I think, along with many others that have been brought up, and that is Moldova has taken this responsibility very seriously to stand against the Russians. They have been stopping the Russians from coming in. Uniformed people who have been trying to enter into Moldova and going to Transnistria, Moldovans have stopped them. But they seem to be doing it alone. Although there is some cooperation going on with the West, but there is not that much of support for the Moldovan authorities, the government, that is trying to stand against the Russian infiltration to this side of Ukraine. And a good example, to be very honest, is that when Moldovan senior officials come to Washington, how well are they received in the halls of power, whether it's the State Department, Department of Defense, and others. So I think the panel members over here and people in the audience, if they are aware of what Moldova has tried to do on its own, and how this really affects the U.S. national security interests in that region, Black Sea, and in general, I think we should be doing a lot more than what we are doing at this point. Wanted to hear the comments from Ambassador Vershbow. Do you see it that way, the way I'm seeing it, that we need to support them more to make sure that one country that is standing between Russia's further expansion to the West, and in fact at the border of NATO and the European Union, really needs to be strengthened, because that's the only buffer zone left?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I were the chief decision maker, I would certainly devote more resources to supporting Moldova and Ukraine and Georgia, because I think ultimately we have to stand up for freedom, for our values, and I think there are opportunities now, given the recovery by Moldova from its political crises. Now's the time to do more. But this administration, I think, is also struggling with limited resources. Some of the reductions are self-inflicted in terms of the State Department budget. Hopefully that will be reversed by the Congress. And the issue of higher level treatment, that's a chronic problem for other countries. We heard the Serbian leaders at our Western Balkans event complaining that there hasn't been a presidential visit to Serbia in more than decades. I can't remember when it was. So that may be less susceptible to solution, but at least in the case of Moldova, there is an Assistant Secretary of State for Europe who I think cares about Moldova and as part of Central Europe, and we want to see Moldova take its place as a thriving democracy in Central Europe. So keep making the case.
I'd like to jump in too. I agree with you, Mr. Ambassador, and I would add 3 points. One, I think that the growing support we have here and in NATO, more broadly in Europe, for Ukraine is good news for Moldova as well as for Georgia. Point two, what we need actually is a policy, a single policy, with nuances of course, which addresses the entire gray zone, and especially those countries in the gray zone, meaning Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, that are facing extraordinary pressure from Moscow. But that would also include, again, with variations, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Belarus. That's point two. And point three, this is just the start of a great deal of Moldova programming here at the Atlantic Council you'll see over the next 6 months, next year. Okay.
Watch this space.
Okay, next question, please. Microphone's coming from behind you.
Thank you very much. What a refreshing discussion after listening for years long statements at the UN.
And you are?
My name is Ion Botnar. I'm former permanent representative to the United Nations. Good afternoon. At the previous, Vice Speaker Leanca mentioned that in order to keep this pro-European, pro-Western trend in Moldova, this team, pro-European parties, they need to win the next elections. It was also mentioned that only 20-25% of the radio TV in Moldova belongs to local. Everything else is produced in Russia. I think media becomes an issue of national security and not just communication. Do you think that the content of this 20-25% that is now produced in Moldova, locally produced, gives you a lot of optimism that after the adoption of this legislative step in cleaning a little bit the area, gives you some optimism on having the right help and the right public opinion for elections? And second, a very short one. Ambassador Weshbo, he mentioned Transnistria as a puppet regime, and I'm signing totally to this. The central government is negotiating now with Transnistria, the last negotiations. I see a lot of optimism. Any negotiation is a process of give and take. Those measures that were listed, I see them most as give and nothing take. Because we are opening, for instance, was decided to open a bridge. Was it also decided that there will be no military border guards from Transnistrian side of that border, as it is the case in other areas? And also, because now the central government has much more leverage over this regime due to situation in Ukraine than before. I think all of these details needs to be spelled out, first of all, for the public opinion, because you are hearing a lot of comments from a camp to whom I do not necessarily belong, that actually this is a saving operation of joint economic interest from the both sides of the Dnistru River, that not necessarily plays in the hands of the central government. So any clarification will be very much appreciated. Thank you.
I don't think I'm in a position to answer that question. I don't know enough about the ins and outs of the bridge project or any of the other dimensions. Maybe.
Well, let me try to address the first issue, the first question Ambassador Botnar asked. Of course, we understand that just by shutting down the news programs and political talk shows broadcasted by the Russian TVs is not enough. We all understand that we need to raise and improve the quality of the content, especially on the public TV and radio channel which Moldova has, because it's still a very archaic and very provincial, and it's not competitive at all. And the best solution, of course, would be to address all the challenges simultaneously. But at least now we addressed one issue by what the Parliament has done today, by approving this new legislation. And I hope very much that we will be able to focus on the quality of the local content. We need to make it much more competitive. We need to make it focusing also on, to some extent, the national interest. And I'm not afraid to say that public TV should reflect, should focus, should answer the issues which are related to the national priorities of the Republic of Moldova. It's not propaganda. It's something else, but we need to convey the necessary message to our people, because again, someone mentioned in the first panel, I think Sergio, the perceptions about this infrastructure project, the road paid by American government, American people, and the perception it was done by the Russians. And it's not the only one example. So it shows again that we don't have a very effective machinery, tools, instruments to inform, not to disinform, to objectively inform the citizens of Moldovan society on who is our friend and who is not our friend. On the second issue, well, I would share a philosophy that we always, in the process of negotiations, have to not just give something to those from Transnistria, but also to make sure that they also make certain concessions. And if there are still issues on which I personally do not agree, I mean, they can come to Chisinau, their so-called leadership, travel through the airport of Chisinau, and in order for Moldovan ministers and members of parliament to enter the region, you need a special permission. Are we using the new realities, and I mentioned Ukraine, which is very much on our side, in order to put a bit of benign pressure on them? I think it still has to be done. So what has been agreed, I think it's positive overall, because it proved that there is a certain progress. But we need now to focus on various elements in order to prepare the grounds for future settlement. And that's what we need, a vision, a very effective communication in first place with Ukraine, but also with Americans and the EU. And I'm sure that then we could produce certain positive results in this respect.
Okay, next question. Please, right there.
Thank you. I'll try not to sound so nervous this time. I think there's two really promising opportunities in Moldova. First, on the energy side, and that is for willow biomass to supply renewable energy for heating, both on the residential side and the municipality side. Back in 2012, the two principals of Cheneme, the NGO we work with, said we'd really like to go to Sweden and look at what the Swedes are doing in this area. We funded them to go up there. We visited a project in Romania, taking a cluster approach of government, nonprofit, entrepreneurs, and visiting a willow biomass. And willow biomass, for people who are not familiar with it, and I certainly wasn't, it looks like bamboo. It grows to 30 feet in 3 years. You chop it down, you chip it. And this can be used for heating at home, and can also be used for heating municipalities in Moldova, because they use a central heating system very often to heat the local government offices. And we visited Neninoy, and they were very interested in looking at this, but I think it was too far ahead of its time. And over the last 5 years, UNDP has funded an agricultural waste biomass program, taking some agricultural waste, hopefully not too much, from the fields, but burning that in biomass boilers for schools. And so you have this infrastructure that's been building up over the last several years. So right now, there's a pilot program going on replicating that cluster approach in Moldova with a Moldovan entrepreneur. So I would really encourage the Moldovan government, the ministries that are relevant to that, energy, but also investment, because it does provide a good rate of return, to look at willow biomass. It can provide additional revenue for local farmers. It can use agricultural lands which are eroded, and it can be used to grow this, and it's an exciting opportunity. So I hope the Moldovan government looks at that. The other exciting opportunity in Moldova, and that is also because we've had the privilege of being involved with civil society in Moldova and their grassroots efforts of going out into communities. And they've been very successful the last several years, last 3 or 4 years, going out to local communities and telling them about the benefits of being part of the EU and telling them the real story and going out there. And they've been very effective going out into the village level, and the reception has been very good. And I think to encourage what you're trying to do really has to be done at the grassroots level. And civil society is doing that now. They just need support. It's unfortunate the United States Embassy in Chisinau has canceled its democracy grants program. And that is very, very unfortunate. It was very effective, and it's just recently been discontinued. Hopefully, the National Endowment for Democracy will continue their grant program in Moldova. But the word has to get out to these local villages, and they're doing an excellent job doing that. So it's a really promising opportunity that I hope we in the United States continue to support. Thanks.
I mean, I think it's a very right approach, and I can thank you very much for what you've done in order to train our NGOs, take them to other countries, show them the best examples. And again, I'm very grateful to you for your commitment and your passion to continue to help us. On biomass, I think we are doing pretty well. We have commitments by 2025 to have 25% of renewable energy. And we are already the threshold of 17 and continue to develop it because this is a part of the strategy also for the security.
I would just say civil society does have a great role also in spreading the truth about NATO and why Moldova, even with the status of neutrality, can benefit from cooperation with NATO. I think the NATO liaison office, as I recall, is being built on a foundation laid by an NGO that ran this sort of small but very effective information operation. Now with NATO assistance and funding, maybe they can have more impact around the country.
Well, we definitely need to work on NATO's image in Moldova because the positive image is still only around 25%. So I'm afraid here, because of the Russian TV channels, NATO is still perceived as an aggressive bloc. Unfortunately, NATO is not attacking us. Maybe you should do it and then the perception would change. But definitely, let's see in 1 year. Following the opening of tomorrow liaison office, following today's decision in Parliament, let's see in 1 year, are we able to change the perception of it? I hope we see some good, steady progress on it.
Just in short, some comments. So first of all, point taken. We'll talk to our colleagues who deal with these specific issues. The second issue, I refer to one of the strategic communications issues you mentioned, namely working with civil society and how we can communicate best. Of course, grants are more than welcome. I also believe that in terms for the next year, everybody, and here I would like to connect to the previous question, or more generally on the media environment and the percentage of relevant content. I think that we should learn something from Russian propaganda, namely the fact that it's highly emotional. And I think that in a majority of cases, we tend to focus whenever we communicate success, whether it's success brought by grants from the West or success in reforms. In doing that expectations management and that hope management, which is very important in Moldova, not just to vote for a specific party, but more generally to see the country's, the people's expectations for a brighter future, I personally think we should, first of all, coordinate more in between us, governmental, parliamentary efforts, embassies, NATO liaison office, and EU delegation, and so on. Because in the majority of cases, of course, there's a perception that everybody should start doing things, but we don't really engage in coordinating each other. Like, a simple issue, right? Who addresses the issue? One of the basic issues used by Russian propaganda, demonization of Europe as gay Europa. Who addresses progressive values in society? Do we stand by, for example, with the parliamentary majority who say it's the issue of the EU delegation? Do we wait and say we own the topic, we should deal with this? So I think there's a lot of room for coordination. And in terms of what's happening in next year, it's not only about TV, it's also about social networks. Of course, not only Facebook, also about Onoklasniki, VKontakte, and so on. But separate from that, and I think that also the pro-European opposition is learning from this. For example, Maia Sandu has recently launched a newspaper. And this is a good communications tool because the Don is all over the place with the socialists, with their newspapers all around the country. It's immersed agriculture, so it's also a great platform to communicate, to engage with people on the ground.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to add one more point. I don't know about the cutoff of funds for democracy building in Moldova. I wouldn't be surprised though if it's a result of the general cut in the State Department budget and on the aid side. Okay, next question. You'll have a microphone in 30 seconds. The microphone is about to arrive.
Oh, okay. We heard today that Moldova needs a lot of help.
Please identify yourself.
Elena Dragalin, Moldova Aid. We heard today that Moldova needs a lot of help from the US, from the European Union, and we can all agree on that. My question is actually was going to be the same as Ambassador Chowdhury. What can Moldova do itself without any help? But I'll be more specific than to have a question a little bit different. And I will refer to Transnistria and specifically to the 14th Russian army there. What can Moldova do to have Russian army leave Transnistria? And why I'm asking this question, I was looking on the web page of the UN, and I thought I saw that Moldova asked the UN to have that issue discussed in the September session. Then it appeared again that Moldova asks to be discussed in the October session, which I assume it was I could not find where they said, okay, don't discuss it in September, we'll discuss it in October. Later in October, Moldova, in writing, asked the UN to not to discuss the issue of Russian army in Transnistria. And my question is like, why do that 2 times? When is Moldova going to have that question on the UN agenda, and how can Moldova do something on their own, like when it's up to them to do something? And I assume the question is to the Vice Speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question, and let me thank you for what we do here in the US in order to mobilize the Moldovan community and to keep their focus on Moldova. Thank you very much, Elena. Now, on the what can we do on our own, there are many issues and areas where we can do much better on our own. But as to the issue of the Russian troops withdrawal, I'm very skeptical to what it concerns our abilities on our own to convince the Russians to get rid of their troops in Moldova. UN resolution which the government proposed is still on the agenda. You have next to you our former ambassador, and he will explain you the bureaucracy within the UN. In order to get to the General Assembly's agenda, you need to go through a General Committee, if I'm not mistaken, and the Russian Federation was quite able to block so far, from what I understand, the passing of this issue towards the General Assembly. I'll be tomorrow in New York to meet several ambassadors, hopefully also the boss of the General Assembly, Mr. Lychek, and we'll discuss again this issue. What shall we do in order to make sure that this issue will be on the agenda? But we have to understand, even once the resolution is adopted by the General Assembly, it will have a symbolical impact, which is very important, but doesn't mean that things will move immediately on the ground. I think my personal view, and I hope we will discuss it at home in the coalition, we also need to relaunch an invitation to the Russian Minister of Defense to discuss the very practical issues on the destructions on the site of the ammunitions especially, or if they want to take them to Russia. And from what I know, Ukrainian side would be ready to help in case Moscow, although I have doubts to believe that they would do it now. But again, we need to be proactive. Here I would agree with you, but otherwise to believe that we can do it on our own in this respect, I am doubtful. And we have an experience of 26 years, and bilateral agreements, and OC decisions, and international law, which is maybe even more important, and so far.
I agree with you, and I don't think we are realistic, but I wanted to ask what is the position of this administration, Moldovan administration, on that. Like, I think it will make a statement what the position is if you put this question on the agenda. If you just ignore it because the result is not going to be the result you want, then...
No, we will insist. We will insist on it.
I think it's significant that Moldova now has formally declared that Russian troops are there without its consent. I mean, that's for many years. It unfortunately did have your government's consent.
No, never. Sorry, Ambassador.
Well,
never had our consent.
Well, when it was a peacekeeping mission.
No, it's different. We still insist on the former 14th Army, which was led sometimes long ago back.
Okay, I stand corrected.
Peacekeeping, it's a bit different arrangements. Yeah. We want to transform them into civilian and under certain OSCE-led mission, but it's different.
But one thought, if you're going to be engaging with Mr. Lajczak, is to, if you can't find the way to get your own resolution, maybe you could piggyback on next year's Ukraine resolution, which, given that you both have Russian troops on your territory without your consent, maybe at least you could get a paragraph about Moldova as part of a common resolution.
Right.
But I think the best thing you can do is continue to work with Ukraine to control the border, and particularly to control trade and stamp out as much corruption as you can, because the Russians ultimately benefit from that. And if we can reduce the benefits to the Russians of their continued occupation of Transnistria, it might sort of expedite the political decision that they'll ultimately need to make, that it's not paying off to preserve this presence.
Okay, we have a question, last question left in the back.
I'll be very brief. My name is Florin Pindic-Blaj. I am Honorary Consul of Republic of Moldova for the States of North Carolina since 1999. Welcome, everyone from Moldova delegation. It's an honor to be here. And I'll not talk about NATO or military. In Moldova, the life starts in a village. And all of those people, mostly, they know the village is a heart. And I'm involved with my humanitarian organization since 1989 in Moldova. And I watch the process, what is going on, especially, closing the orphanages and Moldova moving toward the European Union standards. A thing which happened recently, closing the schools. Just happened, I was in another country in Central America, third world country, and that area was providing about 90% of budget of entire country. But they had 97 children stay home because there were not 2 classrooms in the entire big area for the children to be in the school. I came from Moldova last month, and Mr. Vice Speaker Leanca, Mr. Radu, my heart is bleeding. I used to say I'm born Romanian, American citizen, but my heart of service is in Moldova. I'm asking you, is there a program? I know there is. When will be then when those schools in the villages do not close or to reopen? I just beg and ask you, urge you, do something. You want to win public opinion through media, which Moldova democratic government has only heard about 25%. We lose entire village in their support, in their distrust. If there is, doesn't take too much. And if Moldovan government do not have enough resources, I see here ambassadors, former ambassadors, with the help of American charities, NGOs, great heart of what American people are doing, people to people, schools to schools, NGO to NGO. We could keep those children back and not wake up them in the morning, go through the mud to other village. I just dream to see those villages full of children again. The children is not our future tomorrow. They are today there. Consider and do something to reopen those schools, and with the help of, I count on all those from here, from America. Moldova is very much loved because of its beauty, because of the nature, because of its people. But before you are people and politicians, you are children. Let's think about these children today, who will be tomorrow, engineers, teachers, mechanics, constructors, and some of them politicians. But let's help them to have a future and to wake up in a home and to be in a classroom in their village. Thank you.
Well, thank you not just for this passionate plea for Moldovan children and the education in Moldova, but thank you also for what you've done for more than 20 years to help those in need in Moldova. As to the schools, the only thing I can say at this stage is that the Minister of Education 1 or 2 months ago made a decision not to close anymore any school in the rural areas. And what I can also hope is that the economic situation improves, more money comes to the budget, so we will be able to keep alive even those schools where the number of pupils is relatively small and difficult to sustain it financially.
Well, thank you all for coming. It was wonderful to have you here, and we'll be doing more Moldova events in weeks and months to come.